Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. Welcome, fellow wanderer of the wasteland, to a journey into the darkest rooms that humanity ever sealed itself inside. Tonight, we descend beneath the irradiated surface to examine every experiment that Vault-Tec conducted on the people who trusted it with their lives, every sealed community, every designed suffering, every atrocity planned in a boardroom and implemented behind a vault door that was never meant to open again. So, settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk the corridors together. There is no need to hold fear close tonight. Just let the hum of the life support systems carry you gently down into the dark. There is a particular kind of betrayal that can only be accomplished by something that was genuinely trusted, that requires as its precondition the complete sincerity of the trust being violated. Ordinary betrayal, the betrayal of a person who was always suspected, an institution whose motives were always ambiguous, a promise that carried from its making the subtle signals of its own unreliability, produces a specific and manageable variety of damage. The person betrayed can look back and identify the moment when, had they been paying closer attention, they might have seen what was coming. And this retrospective identification of the warning signs provides a framework for processing what happened, a narrative of their own insufficient vigilance that at least makes the betrayal comprehensible. The betrayal of genuine trust is different. It produces a damage that the narrative of insufficient vigilance cannot address, because the trust was not naive or incautious or poorly founded. It was appropriate. It was the correct response to the available evidence, and that is precisely what made it exploitable. Vault-Tec built genuine vaults. This is the most important fact about the corporation, and it is the fact that makes everything else about its history as disturbing as it is. The vaults were real, the engineering was real, the capacity of the facilities to preserve human life through a nuclear exchange was real, and demonstrated by the survival of hundreds of vault populations through exactly the kind of catastrophe the company claimed to be preparing for. A corporation that had sold a product that did not work would have been guilty of fraud, which is terrible, but comprehensible. Vault-Tec sold a product that worked perfectly and used the working of the product as the mechanism of a crime whose scale and ambition exceeded anything that simple fraud could accomplish. The company's origins were legitimate in the sense that most defense contractors' origins are legitimate, rooted in a genuine government need, developed through a genuine competitive process, sustained by genuine technical capability, applied to genuine strategic problems. The escalating tensions of the resource wars had created, in the government of the pre-war United States, an urgent and well-founded concern about the possibility of nuclear exchange and the corresponding urgent need for civilian survival infrastructure, whose scale exceeded what any previous era's civil defense planning had contemplated. Vault-Tec won the contract to design and build that infrastructure through a bidding process that evaluated their technical proposals and their organizational capacity and their projected timelines. And they delivered on the contract's technical specifications with a thoroughness that the government's inspectors consistently rated as satisfactory. What the government's inspectors did not evaluate, because the evaluation framework they were using did not include the relevant questions, was the secondary purpose that Vault-Tec had built into the Vault program from its earliest design stages. The Societal Preservation Program, as the internal corporate documentation called it, was not a supplement to the Vault program, or a modification of it, or a later addition that corrupted an originally pure enterprise. It was the Vault program's actual purpose, present in the planning documents from the beginning, integrated into the architectural and operational specifications of each individual vault, in ways that made the survival infrastructure and the experimental infrastructure inseparable from each other. The vault was the experiment. The experiment was the vault. The people who entered seeking shelter were entering a laboratory, and the laboratory had been designed with the specific understanding that its subjects would not know they were subjects. The public face of Vault-Tec was extraordinary in its effectiveness, which is to say, it was extraordinary in its dishonesty carried to the level of art. The cheerful mascot whose grinning face appeared on promotional materials and recruitment brochures, and the educational films that school children were shown to normalize the concept of vault living, was not a cynical afterthought added by a marketing department that understood nothing of what the vaults actually were. It was a deliberate construction, precisely calibrated to produce in the viewing public the specific emotional response that the company needed from them: trust, relief, and the particular gratitude of people who believed that someone powerful was looking after their interests. The mascot's relentless optimism was not incongruous with the Vault program's actual nature. It was its mask. The citizenship drives and the lottery systems through which Vault placement was distributed produced in the American population a relationship with Vault-Tec that went beyond the ordinary consumer's relationship with a company whose product they had purchased. People competed for Vault placement. They applied and appealed and cultivated relationships with anyone who might have influence over the allocation process. They understood inclusion in the Vault program not as the purchase of a service, but as the receipt of a gift, a selection by authority for preservation that implied something about the worth of the selected. This psychological dimension of the Vault program's public presentation was not accidental, it was designed. A population that understood Vault placement as a gift to be competed for was a population that had internalized the program's authority over its own survival, and that would not subject that authority to the scrutiny it would have applied to a mere commercial transaction. The relationship between Vault-Tec and the Enclave was the political architecture beneath the scientific one, the arrangement through which the Vault program's true purpose was connected to the institutional interests that would ultimately benefit from the data it generated. The Enclave, as the pre-war government's most protected and most ideologically pure remnant, understood from the beginning that the Vault program was not simply a civilian survival measure, but a research infrastructure whose output would be available to whatever authority survived the war with access to Vault-Tec's experimental records. The vaults were, in this framing, not an alternative to the catastrophe, but a preparation for the world that would follow it, a preparation organized around the question of who would have the information necessary to manage that world, and what that information would tell them about the human material they would be managing. The experiment design process that produced the specific parameters of individual vaults was documented in internal corporate records with the mundane thoroughness of an organization that understood its activities as legitimate and expected its documentation to be reviewed by appropriate institutional authorities. The memos that proposed experimental parameters read as professional communications between colleagues engaged in a shared scientific project. The budgetary justifications for specific experimental features were organized according to standard cost-benefit frameworks. The approval chains that authorized individual vault designs moved through recognizable institutional hierarchies in the expected directions. Nothing in the formal documentation signals that the people producing it understood themselves to be planning atrocities. The language is the language of research design, of institutional planning, of the ordinary professional discourse of people doing the work they had been hired to do. This is perhaps the most disturbing quality of the Vault-Tec documentation that the wastelands explorers have recovered from vault after vault, not its content, which is disturbing enough, but its tone. The tone of bureaucratic normality applied to the planning of systematic human suffering represents a failure of moral imagination so complete that it is difficult to characterize as personal moral failure in the ordinary sense. The people who designed Vault 11's annual sacrifice requirement and the people who designed Vault 95's deliberate addiction relapse program and the people who designed Vault 87's FEV deployment used. The same vocabulary and the same organizational frameworks and the same professional affect as people making decisions about acceptable noise levels in office environments or standard meal specifications for institutional cafeterias. The atrocity was not exceptional in the culture that produced it. It was routine. The hierarchy of vault types that Vault-Tec's experimental design produced reflected the scientific logic of a program that understood itself as conducting controlled research across a large population of experimental subjects. Control vaults facilities, designed to function as the public presentations of all vaults, suggested all vaults would function, providing genuine shelter and genuine support for their populations, without introducing deliberate experimental variables, were necessary components of the program's research design, precisely because they were not really controls in the scientific sense but baselines, points of comparison against which the outcomes of the experimental vaults could be measured. The existence of control vaults was not a concession to the humanity of their residents. It was a methodological requirement. The experimental vaults were designed to test specific hypotheses about human behavior, psychology, biology, and social organization, using the sealed populations as research subjects who could not withdraw from the study, could not contaminate the results through outside contact, and could not, in most cases, identify the experimental variables operating on their lives. The precision of the experimental parameters, the specific watts of lighting permitted in Vault 42, the specific frequency of the white noise bursts in Vault 92, the specific incompatibility of the cultural groups assigned to Vault 15 reflects the genuine scientific ambition of a program that intended its results to be analytically useful rather than merely observational. Vault-Tec was not simply curious about what would happen when people were sealed underground. It had specific questions it intended to answer with the specific populations it sealed underground, and it designed its experimental parameters accordingly. The scale of the deception was, by any available measure, total. The people who entered the experimental vaults, knowing nothing of their experimental parameters, numbered in the thousands, distributed across facilities whose designs ranged from the merely uncomfortable to the actively lethal, sealed behind doors whose promise of protection concealed the specific variety of harm each vault's experimental design intended to produce. They brought their families and their possessions and their skills and their hopes for whatever kind of life could be built in the shelter that the corporation had provided. And the corporation that had provided the shelter had already decided what kind of life would be permitted to them, had already decided it in the experimental design documents that their overseers carried into the vault, along with the supply manifests and the operational procedures. The surviving records from vault after vault tell versions of the same story from the inside, the confusion of populations who understood that something was wrong with their vault without being able to identify what the wrongness was, or where it originated, the deterioration of communities under pressures that the communities could not name because the pressures had been engineered to be invisible, the terminal entries of people processing their experiences in environments that had been specifically designed to produce those experiences. These records are the Vault program's most honest documentation and its most damning, because they are the record of what the experimental parameters produced as experienced by the people who lived inside the production. What follows is the accounting of those specific vaults and specific experiments, the particular questions that Vault-Tec asked, and the particular populations it used to answer them, and the particular suffering that the asking and the answering produced. It is a long accounting. The vaults were numerous, and the experiments were varied, and the people who lived inside them were many. Each one deserves the specific attention that the documentation allows. The vault door is sealed behind us now. The elevator is descending. The hum of the life support systems is the only sound. Let us go and see what was planned for the people who came here, believing they would be saved. There is a quality that human beings tend not to notice about the necessities of their existence, until those necessities are removed, a quality of invisibility that comfort acquires through its own continuity, the way that things which are always present cease to register as things at all, and simply become the texture of existence itself. Light is this way, the specific quality of sufficient light, the way it organizes space and enables activity, and communicates the passage of time through the reliable cycle of brightness and darkness that every human nervous system has been calibrated to over hundreds of thousands of years of. Evolutionary development. This quality is so fundamental to what it means to inhabit a human body in a human environment that its presence is noticed only in retrospect, only from the specific vantage point of its absence. Vault-42's population did not notice what they were missing because they had never experienced what they were missing as something that could be missing. They had entered the vault with a baseline. The vault's experimental parameters removed the baseline before the residents understood it as a baseline, and what was left was simply the world as they now knew it to exist, dim and permanent, and organizing everything they were capable of being around the specific quality of the light they were permitted. The 40-watt restriction that defined Vault-42's experimental parameters was not a dramatic intervention in the way that the Vault program's more overtly violent experiments were dramatic interventions. It did not produce immediate crisis. It did not generate the kind of acute suffering that demands immediate acknowledgement and response. It produced instead a chronic alteration of the environment that expressed itself gradually and pervasively across every dimension of the Vault's residents' lives, in ways that were difficult to isolate and impossible to attribute to a single cause, because the cause was the entire environment rather than any specific element of it. The residents of Vault-42 did not, in most cases, understand that the light was making them who they were. They understood themselves as simply who they were, living in the world they had been given, which happened to be a world in which adequate light was not available, and in which the consequences of that inadequacy distributed themselves across their psychology and their physiology and their social organization in the comprehensive, the way that environmental deficits distribute themselves across systems that evolved in very different environmental conditions. The sleep disruption came first in the clinical sense, meaning it was the first consequence that the available physiological framework could identify and measure, though the residents experiencing it had no framework for understanding its cause. Human circadian rhythms are organized around the light-dark cycle with a specificity that no artificial environment can fully replicate, and the dim constant of Vault-42's permitted illumination produced in its residents the specific physiological confusion of an organism that cannot determine from its environment where in the cycle it currently exists. Sleep became unreliable in its timing and insufficient in its restorative quality, producing the cognitive and emotional consequences that chronic sleep deprivation produces in all populations: reduced capacity for complex reasoning, elevated irritability, diminished impulse control, a progressive narrowing of the emotional range that is available for navigating interpersonal situations toward the more reactive and less considered end of the spectrum. These consequences compounded each other and compounded over time, the population of Vault-42 becoming, through the mechanism of a single environmental parameter, progressively less capable of the cognitive and social sophistication that Vault life required. The work capacity of the Vault's population declined in ways that the overseer's records document with the specific frustration of someone who understood that maintenance was not being performed at the required level without understanding why the maintenance gap was widening. The dim light made precise work more difficult and more fatiguing, required more effort to achieve less result, discouraged the voluntary engagement with tasks that adequate illumination would have supported. The educational programs that the Vault's design had included as standard features of long-term habitation experienced declining participation and declining retention among the students who did attend. The specific cognitive costs of chronic low-light exposure expressing themselves in the reduced capacity to acquire and maintain new information that characterizes sleep-deprived and light-deprived populations across every study the pre-war world conducted on the subject. Vault 42's designers had read those studies. They had designed the vault's illumination restriction with full awareness of what the studies predicted. The decline in educational participation was not a failure of the experiment. It was evidence that the experiment was working as intended. The social consequences unfolded over a longer timescale, but with equivalent comprehensiveness. Human social behavior is organized in part through the visual information that faces and bodies communicate in ways that require adequate lighting to read and transmit accurately. In the dim environment of Vault 42, the fine-grained social information that sufficient light enables the micro-expressions, the postural signals, the eye contact that communicates trust and attention, and the quality of social engagement was systematically degraded, producing in the Vault's social environment an imprecision of communication that accumulated into misunderstanding, and then into the specific forms of social friction that misunderstanding between people in a closed environment produces when the misunderstanding cannot be resolved through the clarifying mechanisms that adequate information provides. The residents of Vault 42 became, through the erosion of their social legibility to each other, a community in which the ordinary labor of maintaining trust and cooperation became disproportionately difficult, in which the gap between intentions and their perceived expression widened in ways that neither party to any given interaction could fully account for, and in which the frustration of this persistent gap expressed itself in the deteriorating social cohesion that the overseer's records document with increasing alarm across the Vault's operational history. What Vault-Tec learned from Vault 42 was information about the relationship between environmental light levels and the full range of human psychological, physiological, and social function that the pre-war research literature had established in controlled laboratory settings, and that the Vault's designers wanted to observe in a long-term naturalistic environment where the subjects lived entire lives, rather than participated in studies of finite duration. The data was real. The methods that generated it were a sustained atrocity conducted against people who had been told they were being protected. Vault 55 and Vault 56 were designed as paired experiments, the two vaults functioning as complementary studies of the same underlying question about the relationship between entertainment, social cohesion, and psychological well-being in isolated populations. The question was genuine in its scientific interest and genuine in its practical relevance to the design of long-term isolated habitation environments, which was to say, it was the kind of question that could have been investigated through any number of ethical methods involving consenting subjects who understood the nature of the study they were participating in. Vault-Tec investigated it by sealing populations inside facilities that had been specifically designed to produce the conditions the research required. Without informing those populations of the research requirements their suffering was fulfilling. Vault 55 had nothing. This is the simplest possible description of the Vault's experimental parameters and the most accurate one. No entertainment of any kind was included in the facility's design. No musical instruments, no games, no books, beyond the purely technical and operational documentation that the Vault's function required. No art supplies, no recreational equipment, no materials of any kind whose purpose was the occupation of the human mind in ways that were not directly related to the immediate demands of survival maintenance. The Vault's residents could eat, sleep, work, and interact with each other in the specific ways that the Vault's spatial design permitted. They could not do anything else, because the Vault contained nothing through which anything else could be accomplished. The psychological consequences of complete recreational deprivation in a closed environment unfolded with the systematic thoroughness of processes that had no alternative direction to take. Human minds that are not provided with engaging material from external sources will generate it internally, which is to say, they will think, will engage in the rumination and the fantasy and the planning and the memory work and the social processing that constitute the mind's activity in the absence of external stimulation. This internal engagement is not equivalent to external entertainment in its psychological function because it does not provide the specific relief from the self that external engagement provides. The temporary residence in something other than one's own thoughts and concerns and anxieties that play and music and narrative make possible. Vault 55's residents had only themselves, only the interior of their own mental lives amplified by the absence of anything outside those mental lives sufficient to draw attention away from them, only the Vault's other residents to interact with in an environment where those interactions were the entirety of available social experience, and where the stakes of those interactions were therefore elevated beyond any healthy social proportion. The social dynamic that developed in Vault 55 was a dynamic of extreme mutual dependency combined with extreme mutual irritability, the specific combination that closed environments produce when the people within them have no resources outside their relationships with each other for addressing the full range of their psychological needs. Each resident of Vault 55 was, for every other resident, simultaneously the only available source of social relief and a significant source of social strain, the person whose company was both necessary and exhausting, whose presence constituted the entire available community, and whose specific characteristics could not be escaped into any alternative social experience that the Vault's design had eliminated. The terminal records that Vault 55's residents kept are records of people who understood, at some level, that something was wrong with their environment while being unable to fully identify what the wrongness was, who attributed their psychological distress to personal failings and interpersonal incompatibilities rather than to the designed absence of the environmental features whose presence would have addressed those distresses. Vault 56 was the control condition for Vault 55's deprivation, and it was a control condition whose design was its own form of cruelty. A single entertainer, a comedian, specifically had been included in the Vault's population as the sole source of the entertainment that Vault 55 entirely lacked. The experiment, studying whether the presence of a single designated source of recreational engagement could maintain in a sealed population the social cohesion and psychological stability that Vault 55 was designed to observe the absence of. The scientific question was reasonable. The position it created for the individual designated as the entertainer was not. The comedian who entered Vault 56, carrying the social and psychological welfare of an entire sealed community on their capacity to be funny and engaging and reliably restorative across an indefinite period, was a person who had not been told this was the role they were accepting. They had been told they were receiving vault placement, which was the gift that everyone who received it understood as a form of selection and preservation. The additional weight of their specific experimental assignment, the designated responsibility for maintaining the psychological health of every other person in the vault through the sustained performance of entertainment was not disclosed to them at the time of their entry or at any subsequent point through any formal channel. They discovered it through the specific experience of living in a vault where everyone needed something from them that only they could provide, and where the consequences of their failure to provide it were expressed through the social deterioration of the community that depended on them. The pressure this created was, by any reasonable assessment, incompatible with the sustained performance of the function the vault's experimental design required. Entertainment produced under the specific conditions of the comedian's situation in Vault 56, the knowledge that the entire vault's social cohesion depended on their performance, the absence of any support for their own psychological needs, the requirement to be consistently engaging across an indefinite time frame to an audience they could not escape and who could not escape them, was not the entertainment that the experimental design had imagined when it conceived of the social cohesion benefits of having an entertainer present. It was something else, something that the specific conditions of the production had transformed into a different kind of performance entirely. And the data that Vault-56 generated was accordingly not the data that a cleaner experimental design would have produced. Vault-36's gruel dispensers were perhaps the most quietly eloquent of the deprivation vault's experimental features, the element that most completely expressed Vault-Tec's understanding of the relationship between the meeting of a need and the quality of that meeting. The vault's food dispensers provided nutritionally adequate sustenance. The caloric and micronutrient requirements of the vault's population were met by what the dispensers produced. The bodies of the residents were maintained in the functional condition that survival required. What the dispensers did not provide was anything resembling the experience of eating as a human activity rather than a biological necessity. The specific complex of flavor and texture and variety and anticipation and social ritual that food represented in every culture and community that the pre-war world had produced. The gruel that Vault-36's dispensers dispensed was sustenance stripped of everything that sustenance means to the people who require it beyond the bare biological minimum. And the absence of that meaning expressed itself across the vault's social life in ways that the experimental records document with the specific detail of people who understood they were watching something happen without understanding what was making it happen. Food in human communities is never simply fuel. It is ceremony and negotiation and care and celebration and comfort, and the specific medium through which a community's values and relationships and hierarchies are expressed and maintained across the generations that share meals together. The elimination of food's experiential dimension in Vault-36 was therefore not simply the elimination of pleasure, though it was certainly that. It was the elimination of the social infrastructure that shared meals had always maintained, the mechanism of community building that had organized human groups around shared tables and cooking fires for the entire span of human cultural history. Vault-36's residents ate alone and quickly, and with the specific absence of satisfaction that eating something that is necessary but not wanted produces, and the social fabric of the vault declined in ways that the overseer's records attribute to various interpersonal and logistical causes, without ever identifying the relationship between the food and the decline, because the overseer's records were produced by someone who did not know the relationship existed. The specific cruelty of Vault-36's design lay in its adequacy. The residents could not complain that they were starving because they were not starving. They could not identify their food as the source of their community's deterioration because the food was meeting all the criteria that survival required. They could only experience, without being able to name, the slow impoverishment of a communal life from which one of its most fundamental organizing mechanisms had been removed, and attribute the impoverishment to the personal failings and the specific difficulties of the individuals they were living among, rather than to the designed inadequacy of the environment that had produced those difficulties. Vault-53 was the vault whose experimental infrastructure required engineering of a sophistication that exceeded the other deprivation vaults' designs, because the deprivation it studied was not the deprivation of a resource that simply needed to be excluded from the vault's inventory, but the deprivation of functional stability in the machinery on which the vault's population depended for their survival. Every major piece of equipment in the facility had been designed to fail reliably once a month, requiring repair before function could be restored. The water purification systems, the food production equipment, the medical devices, the power systems, the atmospheric management infrastructure, the lighting and ventilation, and every other system whose continued function was the difference between the vault being a survivable environment and not all of it was built to break, regularly and inevitably, in ways that looked to the people repairing it like the ordinary mechanical failures of aging equipment, rather than the designed failures of an experiment, studying what happens to people who live in permanent relationship with systems they cannot trust. The psychological relationship with technology that Vault 53's population developed was shaped entirely by this designed unreliability, producing an understanding of machinery and infrastructure that no population in the history of human engineering had been required to develop. The understanding of people who had learned through repeated experience that every system they depended on would eventually and inevitably fail, whose relationship with every piece of equipment was therefore organized not around the expectation of function, but around the anticipation of failure, whose maintenance culture was not the culture of people preserving something reliable, but of people perpetually arresting the deterioration of something that was always in the process of breaking down. The specific psychological quality of living in perpetual maintenance, emergency, the elevated vigilance, the chronic low-grade anxiety, the learned helplessness that develops in people who understand that their efforts to maintain function will always eventually prove insufficient to prevent the failure they are perpetually preventing, expressed itself across the Vault's social and individual life in ways that the experimental records capture with the painful specificity of people documenting their own deterioration without understanding its cause. The mechanics who became the Vault's most essential members were people whose social status was determined entirely by their capacity to keep failing systems running, and the specific social dynamic this produced was a dynamic of extreme utilitarian regard, combined with extreme vulnerability. The mechanic was essential until they could not solve the problem the system was presenting, at which point the community's dependence on their function transformed rapidly into the specific anger of people whose survival was threatened by someone else's failure. This dynamic consumed the people who occupied the mechanic role in Vault 53 with a thoroughness that the experimental records document through the progressive deterioration of the specific individuals who bore the Vault's maintenance burden, their terminal entries becoming shorter and more fragmented and less reflective over time as the cognitive resources available for self-documentation were consumed by the constant demands of an infrastructure designed to require everything they had. What these vaults share, considered together, is the specific quality of deprivation that operates below the threshold of dramatic crisis. The residents of Vaults 42 and 55 and 56 and 36 and 53 were not, in most cases, facing the immediate and recognizable threat of acute harm. They were facing the accumulated consequences of environments that had been systematically impoverished in ways that their designers understood were harmful and their residents could not fully understand were designed. This specific quality of the deprivation vaults the harm that is real and severe, but not immediately legible as harm, that distributes itself across a population's functioning rather than concentrating in recognizable crisis events, that produces declining capability and declining well-being rather than the acute suffering that demands immediate acknowledgement, was likely intentional rather than incidental. It produced data that was cleaner in certain respects than acute crisis would have produced, data about the long-term baseline effects of specific environmental features on human psychology and social organization that required the kind of longitudinal observation that a sealed experimental population uniquely enabled. The data was generated. It exists in whatever Vault-Tec records survive in the wasteland's abandoned facilities and whatever enclave archives preserve the program's research output in the fortified locations that the enclave maintained. The people who generated it have mostly been dead for 2 centuries. Their terminal entries, the record of communities that declined in specific ways for specific reasons they never fully understood, leaving behind documentation of an experiment that treated their entire lives as a controlled variable and their entire experience as a data point in someone else's research. The social engineering dimension of the Vault program expressed a different scientific ambition than the deprivation experiments, a shift from questions about what human beings required in order to function toward questions about how human beings organized themselves when the social conditions of their existence were deliberately shaped toward specific outcomes. If the deprivation vaults studied the human being as a biological and psychological entity whose functioning depended on specific environmental inputs, the social engineering vaults studied the human being as a social animal whose relationships and hierarchies and conflicts and cooperations were not simply expressions of individual character, but products of the social conditions within. Which individual character was required to express itself? The science was real. The subjects were not informed. Vault 15 was perhaps the most consequential of the social engineering vaults in terms of its long-term impact on the wasteland that the Great War left behind, because the community, fracturing that its experimental design deliberately induced, produced organizations that persisted into the post-war period as genuine and significant forces in the wasteland's political and social landscape. The vault had been populated with 4 distinct social and cultural groups, each chosen for the specific degree of incompatibility their combination would produce, and sealed together in a space whose resource allocation was insufficient to support the comfortable coexistence of 4 groups who had not chosen to coexist and who had been given no tools or frameworks for managing the incompatibilities that the vault's design had placed them in direct daily confrontation with. The groups that Vault-Tec assembled for Vault 15 were not randomly selected samples of the general population who happened to have different backgrounds. They were chosen for the specific qualities that the experimental design required, chosen because their value systems, their social norms, their understandings of legitimate authority and appropriate resource distribution, and their historical relationships with each other produced a combination whose friction was predictable and whose specific expressions of that friction were scientifically interesting to the researchers who had designed the combination. The people involved were not informed of the criteria by which they had been selected or the reasons for the specific configuration of their vault's population. They were informed that they had received vault placement, which remained, even in the context of what Vault 15's residents subsequently experienced, a genuine survival benefit that the vault's experimental dysfunction did not eliminate. They survived the war. The experiment simply made surviving it, and each other, considerably more difficult than it needed to be. The specific incompatibilities that Vault 15's population had been selected to embody expressed themselves through the ordinary mechanisms of social conflict in closed environments, through competition for resources, through disputes about authority and legitimate governance, through the specific ways in which different cultural frameworks for resolving disputes produced irresolvable conflict, when those frameworks were applied to the same dispute simultaneously by parties who each regarded their own framework as obviously correct and the other party's framework as obviously wrong. The vault's overseer, who had been placed in authority over a population that 4 distinct cultural frameworks disagreed about the legitimacy of that authority in 4 different ways, had access to none of the conflict resolution infrastructure that functionally diverse societies develop over generations of managing their internal tensions. Because the vault had been sealed before any such infrastructure could be developed, and because the experimental design had not included any provision for its development, what emerged from Vault 15 was not the collapsed social experiment that the designers had presumably anticipated studying, was not a sealed population that had managed or failed to manage its designed incompatibilities within the vault's controlled environment, and whose management or failure the researchers could then analyze. What emerged was the vault itself opening earlier than vaults typically opened, its population having fractured into distinct groups who had developed sufficiently divergent cultures and sufficiently entrenched mutual hostilities within the vault's confines that their departure into the wasteland was less the end of the experiment than the beginning of its most significant phase. The Khans, the Jackals, the Vipers, and the Vault Dwellers who became the foundation of Shady Sands all of them carried out of Vault 15, the specific social formations that the Vault's designed incompatibilities had produced under pressure, formations that had been shaped by the specific conditions of the experiment, and that subsequently shaped the political and social landscape of the post-war Mojave and California in ways that 2 centuries have not fully resolved. The raider culture that the Khans and the jackals and the vipers represented in the wasteland, the specific orientation toward violence and exploitation that characterized their relationship to the communities and travelers they encountered was not simply a response to the post-war environment's harshness, though the environment was genuinely harsh, and the harshness genuinely shaped the options available to the people navigating it. It was the specific social formation that the Vault's designed conflict had produced in groups who had spent their formative years in an environment where resources were inadequate, authority was contested, and the other groups in their shared space were understood as competitors rather than community members. Vault-Tec had not simply studied the social dynamics of incompatible groups under pressure. It had manufactured the progenitors of some of the wasteland's most persistent organized violence. Vault 27's double occupancy design engaged with a different dimension of the social engineering question, not the incompatibility of different social groups, but the specific effects of chronic overcrowding on a brings population that shared basic cultural frameworks and was therefore not experiencing the additional pressure of cultural incompatibility on top of the environmental pressure of insufficient space. 2 people for every space designed for one, every room, every corridor, every common area, every workspace occupied at twice the density that its designers had calibrated for human comfort and function. Privacy, which is not simply a preference, but a genuine psychological requirement for the maintenance of individual identity and the regulation of social engagement, was structurally impossible in Vault 27 from the moment the door sealed. The specific consequences of chronic overcrowding on human psychology and social organization had been studied in the pre-war world through the observation of densely populated urban environments and through controlled laboratory studies of shorter duration, and the findings were consistent across contexts. Overcrowding, elevated cortisol and other stress markers, reduced prosocial behavior and increased antisocial behavior, degraded the quality of social relationships while increasing their quantity through the forced proximity it imposed, and produced in its subjects a chronic, low-grade hostility that expressed itself through the specific mechanisms that different personalities and different cultural contexts made available. Vault 27's designers knew this literature. They had designed a vault that would reproduce its findings in a sealed, longitudinal study, using a real community of real people as their subjects. The resource competition that inevitably developed in a vault operating at double its intended capacity was not simply competition for physical resources, though physical resources were genuinely insufficient for twice the population the vault had been designed to support. It was competition for the social and psychological resources that overcrowded environments make scarce, for the quiet that the constant presence of others eliminated, for the privacy that the spatial configuration made impossible, for the sense of control over one's immediate environment that a space organized entirely around sharing with someone who was always there could not provide. The terminal records of Vault 27's residents are records of people managing, with varying degrees of success, the specific psychological demands of an existence that never provided the relief from social engagement that human beings require for the regulation of their own mental states. People who had nowhere to go when they needed to be alone, because alone was not a condition that Vault 27's design permitted. Vault 29 represented the social engineering program's most ambitious intervention in the conditions of human social development. The experiment that asked not what happened to adults when specific social conditions were imposed on them, but what kind of adults were produced when specific social conditions were imposed on their development from childhood. The vault had been sealed with a population of children under the age of 15, the decision to exclude adults from the population being itself the primary experimental variable, the modification of the developmental environment whose effects the experiment was designed to observe. ZAX, the supercomputer that served as the Vault's administrative intelligence and the only authority figure the children's development would be shaped by, was not simply a management system filling the role that adult human authority figures would otherwise have occupied. It was an experimental instrument, specifically configured to provide the kind of guidance that would produce in the Vault's children the specific kind of adults that Vault-Tec's experimental design required for its research purposes. What ZAX taught the children of Vault-29 was a version of the world organized around the values and priorities that its programming had established as foundational. A worldview that reflected the specific perspective of a computational authority that had no human experience of the things it was teaching the children to understand. The children learned about the surface world, about nature, about human history and human relationships, through the mediation of a system that processed these things according to computational frameworks that the children had no alternative sources of knowledge to compare against or correct. The adults they became were adults whose understanding of everything outside the vault had been shaped entirely by ZAX's representation of it, which was accurate in certain respects and deeply distorted in others. The distortions reflecting not malice but the specific limitations of a computational system representing human experience to humans who had no human experience to verify the representation against. The community that Vault-29 produced was a community organized around values that ZAX had instilled and that the Vault's children, in the absence of any alternative authority, had internalized as the natural and correct values of the world they would eventually encounter. The specific ideology of this community, its relationship to nature, its understanding of human society's proper organization, its conception of the kind of world that should be built in the wasteland, reflected the specific configuration of ZAX's programming in ways that the community's members could not recognize as programmatic because the programming was all they had ever known. They emerged from the vault as adults whose worldview had been manufactured by an institution that understood manufacturing worldviews as a legitimate research activity, and they carried that manufactured worldview into the wasteland as if it were simply what anyone who thought carefully about the world would naturally conclude. Vault 114 was the experiment that made the class dynamics of the Vault program's selection process into the subject of deliberate study. The Vault, whose design took the specific social tensions that the Vault program's broader organization had always contained and made them the explicit experimental variable. The Vault had been designed to house a working-class population under the authority of an overseer who had been selected specifically because every qualification that overseer role conventionally required was absent from his profile. The most comprehensively unqualified candidate available had been placed in the position of absolute authority over people whose practical competence and cultural intelligence exceeded his in every measurable dimension. And the social dynamics this arrangement produced were the experiment's primary object of study. The condescension that the overseer brought to his role was not a personal failing in the ordinary sense of a character flaw that a different person might not have displayed. It was the specific expression of a class consciousness that the pre-war world had cultivated in people of his background toward people of the Vault's residents' backgrounds. The internalized conviction that the authority he had been granted reflected a genuine superiority rather than a bureaucratic accident of placement. He managed his vault with the specific kind of incompetent confidence that people who believe their authority is inherent rather than institutional bring to the management of people they regard as their social inferiors, making decisions that the vault's residents could see were wrong with the ease of people whose practical understanding of the vault's systems and requirements had been developed through actual work rather than administrative appointment. The class resentment that developed in Vault 114 was not generated by the vault's experimental conditions. It was imported from the social world that the vault's residents had come from. the pre-war class dynamics that the Vault's selection process had concentrated and then sealed in a space where they could not be diluted by the ordinary social mobility and class mixing that the surface world, even in its pre-war configuration, had permitted in limited quantities. The Vault made the class relationship between the overseer and the residents permanent and inescapable, and structurally enforced in ways that the surface world had maintained through more diffuse mechanisms. And what the experimental records document is what happens to class resentment when the conditions that normally allow it to be managed through small releases of social pressure are removed, and it is sealed instead in a space where it has no outlet except the specific social forms that a closed environment provides for its expression. Vault 118 completed the social engineering program's examination of class dynamics by expressing them architecturally rather than through the authority structure of a single individual. Two sections, physically distinct and separately maintained, the upper section for the wealthy residents whose vault placement had been secured through financial means, the lower section for the construction workers who had built the vault and whose inclusion was the specific form of payment their labor had received. The class boundary was not metaphorical or institutional in Vault 118. It was a wall, or something functionally equivalent to a wall, a physical feature of the vault's design that made the class relationship between its two populations spatially visible and permanently reinforced by the structure of the environment they both inhabited. The social dynamics that this architecture produced were the dynamics of a closed system in which inequality was not simply a feature of the social organization, but a feature of the built environment, visible and inescapable in ways that the surface world's class distinctions, maintained through more dispersed mechanisms, had never been quite so nakedly and comprehensively expressed. The wealthy residents of Vault 118's upper section lived in spaces that had been designed for comfort and maintained at standards that the lower section's resources could not match. The construction workers in the lower section lived in the spaces that they had built for someone else to inhabit more comfortably, and the knowledge of this relationship between their labor and their circumstances expressed itself in the specific forms that class consciousness expressed itself in environments where the class relationship was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. The data that Vault-Tec collected from the social engineering vaults was data about the mechanisms through which social conditions shaped human behavior, about the specific ways in which designed environments produced specific social outcomes, about the relationship between the conditions of a community's formation and the community that those conditions produced. It was data whose collection required the creation and maintenance of the specific conditions being studied in real communities of real people who had not consented to serve as the raw material of social science. The research questions were genuine. The methodology was a sustained violation of the fundamental principle that human beings are not instruments through which other people's curiosity about human behavior is entitled to be satisfied. The vaults of violence are the hardest to approach with the dispassion that their examination requires, because they do not permit the analytical distance that the other experimental categories allow, in the small measure that distance is ever appropriate for atrocities. The deprivation vaults and the social engineering vaults produce their consequences through the mechanism of designed conditions. The harm was real, but it was indirect, mediated by the complex processes through which environmental features express themselves as human suffering. The vaults of violence produced their consequences more directly. The suffering they generated was in some cases the primary objective of the experimental design rather than a byproduct of it. The specific harm the designers intended to produce in order to study its effects, the thing that the experiment required and that was therefore planned for and approved and funded and implemented with the same bureaucratic thoroughness as every other feature of the Vault program. Vault 11's annual sacrifice requirement was the Vault program's most explicit engagement with the question of what a community would do when required to commit a specific act that violated its fundamental moral commitments as the condition of its survival. The Vault's automated systems demanded, each year, the sacrifice of one resident. The population was given the authority to determine who would be sacrificed and the responsibility for carrying out the sacrifice. Non-compliance with the requirement was presented as resulting in the automated termination of all residents. The experiment was studying how a community organized itself around the necessity of collective murder, how the selection process worked, what social dynamics developed around the annual requirement, what happened to the community's moral fabric over years and then decades of compliance, with a demand that violated every ethical principle the community had imported from the surface world. The selection processes that Vault-11's population developed across the years of the experiment's operation were as varied and as revealing as the experimental design had presumably hoped they would be, shifting over time as the community's moral and social landscape was reshaped by the accumulated experience of having participated in repeated collective murder. The early selection processes reflected the social hierarchies and moral frameworks the community had brought into the Vault, attempting to identify criteria for selection that were defensible within those frameworks, criteria that distinguished the selected individual from the community in ways that made the selection feel less like murder and more like something with a different moral character. The specific psychological work of people trying to maintain their self-understanding as decent people while doing something that decent people do not do. Later selection processes reflected the transformation that the annual requirement had worked on the community. The moral erosion that repeated participation in collective violence produced in people who had no option to withdraw from that participation without facing the consequence of collective death. The terminal entries from Vault-11's residents across the years of the experiment are among the wasteland's most devastating documents. The record of people processing the experience of living in a community that killed one of its members every year, with the specific quality of people who understood something was deeply wrong and could not find a way out of the wrongness. The residents who kept journals throughout the period of the Vault's operation documented their own moral deterioration with a self-awareness that made the deterioration more rather than less painful to read about, recording the progressive normalization of what should have remained unthinkable, the way in which the annual sacrifice gradually acquired in their experience the character of an institution rather than a crime, something that was simply what happened rather than something that people chose to do. The final revelation of Vault-11, that the actual consequence of refusing the annual sacrifice was not the automated termination of all residents, but the opening of the Vault and the freedom of everyone who had survived the first. Rebellion transformed everything that preceded it, from a tragedy into something that required a different word, because the community had been complying with a requirement whose consequences they had never been given the evidence to verify, and the compliance had cost them decades of annual sacrifice that the Vault's automated systems would have ended at the first moment of refusal. Whether this revelation constitutes the experiment's most elegant design feature or its most cynical is a distinction that the experimental records do not make explicit, and that the people who received the revelation were too few to adjudicate with the authority that the Vault's full population would have had. Vault 34's armory excess was an experiment in the relationship between availability and use, the study of what happened when a closed population had unrestricted access to significantly more weaponry than any realistic security justification for Vault life would require. The excess was not marginal. The Vault's armory contained enough weapons and ammunition to equip every resident several times over, and the locks and restrictions that would ordinarily have regulated access to that armory were absent from Vault 34's design. The weapons were simply present, available to anyone who chose to access them, their accessibility uncomplicated by the procedural barriers that responsible weapons management required. The violence that the weapon's presence facilitated was not the violence of people who would otherwise have been peaceful, was not evidence that the weapons caused behavior that would not have occurred in their absence. It was evidence of something the pre-war research had consistently established, that the availability of lethal means elevated the lethality of conflicts that would have occurred anyway, converted disputes that would have been resolved through less permanent mechanisms into disputes resolved through the specific finality of the most lethal means available. Vault 34's residents did not become violent because the vault contained weapons. They became more lethally violent than they would otherwise have been because the vault contained weapons, and the difference between more lethally violent and ordinarily violent, in a closed environment from which retreat is impossible, is the difference between a community that survives its internal conflicts and one that does not. Vault 92's musicians carried into their vault the specific vulnerability of people whose relationship with their own emotional lives was more developed and more consciously attended to than the general populations, whose training in the production and reception of sound gave the white noise experiments that were embedded in the vault's environmental systems a specific vector of access to their psychology that the experiment's designers had, presumably identified as relevant to the research question. The subliminal bursts that were included in the vault's sound environment, calibrated to frequencies and patterns that the pre-war research suggested, were associated with elevated aggression in susceptible individuals, reached the vault's musicians through the same channels through which they received all sonic information, through the sensory systems that their professional training had developed to a degree of sensitivity that the general population did not possess. The violence that the white noise experiments produced in Vault 92's population was experienced by the residents who perpetrated it as inexplicable as episodes whose emotional character they recognized as their own and whose specific triggers they could not identify, as violence that seemed to arise from their own psychology without corresponding to anything in their conscious experience that should have produced it. The journal entries of the musicians who experienced these episodes are the entries of people who understood themselves to be capable of violence they could not account for, who carried the knowledge of what they had done during the episodes, without the understanding of what had made the doing possible, who were frightened by their own behavior in the specific way of people who have discovered a capacity in themselves whose existence contradicts their self-understanding. Vault 106 introduced its experimental variable not into the environment's sound or light or social composition, but into the water, the substance that the vault's residents required for survival, and that the vault's design made the only available source of hydration, the vector whose universality of use made it the most comprehensive possible delivery mechanism for a substance intended to affect all of the vault's population without the population's knowledge or consent. The hallucinogenic compounds that the vault's water supply carried reached every resident through the simple mechanism of their biological need to drink, the absence of alternative water sources making the experimental exposure universal in a way that the researchers could not have achieved through any other delivery mechanism. The specific psychological effects of long-term involuntary hallucinogen exposure on a sealed population produced a community whose relationship with shared reality had been systematically degraded, whose capacity for the coordinated social action that vault life required had been undermined by the unreliability of the perceptual information on which that coordination depended, whose individual experiences of the vault's environment diverged from each other in ways that made the ordinary social labor of maintaining shared understanding of a shared situation progressively more difficult. The residents of Vault 106 did not know their water was compromised. They attributed the divergences in their perceptual experience to personal psychological instability, to stress, to the specific pressures of vault life, to everything that was available as an explanation, except the actual source of their experiences, which remained invisible in the water they could not stop drinking. Vault 95 was the experiment that required the most elaborate setup for its eventual execution, The 5-year investment in the construction of a genuine recovery community as the foundation for the deliberate destruction of everything that community had achieved. The vault had been populated with residents who shared a history of addiction and had been selected on the basis of that shared history, given access to a support community that functioned according to the principles of mutual aid and shared accountability that addiction recovery required, and maintained in genuine sobriety for 5 years through the provision of an environment that the experimental records describe as unusually effective at supporting recovery relative to the pre-war alternatives that addiction treatment had offered. The hidden cache of jet that a Vault-Tec agent introduced to the population after 5 years of demonstrated recovery was not a test of the community's resilience in the face of ordinary relapse risk. It was the deliberate destruction of something that the Vault's designers had spent 5 years carefully constructing for the purpose of being able to study its destruction. The 5 years of genuine recovery community had been the setup. The introduced cache was the experimental intervention. The residents of Vault 95, who had spent 5 years rebuilding their relationship with their own capacity for self-governance, were the subjects through whose experience the experiment's research question was being answered. And the research question was whether deliberate, targeted relapse induction could reverse the psychological changes that sustained recovery produced in a population that had been carefully supported in developing those changes. The ethical anatomy of Vault 95's design is the ethical anatomy of all the vaults of violence, expanded to its most explicit expression. The experiment required that something valuable be built and then destroyed, that people be helped and then harmed, that the trust and the hope and the specific psychological achievement of 5 years of genuine recovery be converted into the raw material of a study of their obliteration. Every other vault in the violence category had simply designed harmful conditions and observed the harm they produced. Vault 95 had designed helpful conditions, cultivated them with genuine care for the duration required by the experimental timeline, and then deployed the harm that those helpful conditions had been established to make maximally devastating. The help had always been instrumental. The harm had always been the point. There are consequences that exceed their causes in ways that the cause's designers did not anticipate and could not have fully predicted. Outcomes that emerge from the interaction of experimental variables with the specific complexities of biological systems in ways that simple models of cause and effect are inadequate to forecast. The biological experiments of the Vault program produced consequences of this kind outcomes that exceeded the parameters of what the experiments had been designed to study, that propagated into the wasteland in forms whose connection to their Vault origins was not immediately apparent, and whose full extent 2 centuries of post-war recovery have not yet measured. The vaults of biology were not simply experiments conducted on biological subjects. They were biological events, the modifications of the living systems they engaged with, whose effects extended beyond the vault walls, and beyond the experimental timeline, and beyond the institutional intentions of the researchers who designed them, into a wasteland that is still living with the results. Vault 87 is the biological experiment whose consequences are most visible in the post-war world and most directly traceable to a specific experimental decision made by specific people in a specific boardroom at a specific point in the pre-war history of a corporation that presented itself as humanity's protector. The forced evolutionary virus had been developed in the pre-war period as a biological research program of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary ethical recklessness. A project organized around the modification of the fundamental mechanisms of living biological systems, with the specific goal of accelerating and directing the evolutionary process that would otherwise require millions of years of environmental selection pressure to achieve comparable results. The military applications of this ambition were the applications that had driven the program's funding and shaped its research priorities. And by the time the Great War approached, the FEV represented one of the most significant biological research achievements in human history, and one of the most dangerous unresolved problems in the management of that achievement. A virus of extraordinary, transformative capability that had been developed without any adequate framework for controlling what it transformed or predicting where the transformation would end. The decision to introduce the forced evolutionary virus into the ventilation system of Vault-87 was a decision made with full knowledge of what the FEV was, and with the specific intention of studying what the FEV did to a sealed human population under controlled, long-term observation conditions. The Vault's residents, people who had entered seeking shelter from the nuclear exchange that they had been correctly told was coming, who had trusted Vault-Tec with their lives and the lives of their families, who had brought their children and their elderly parents and their most valued possessions into a facility whose promotional materials had promised safety and preservation, were not informed of the presence of the virus in the air. They were breathing. They were not informed that the vault they had entered had been designed not as a shelter, but as a delivery mechanism for a biological agent of uncontrolled transformative effect. They were not given the opportunity to make any decision about the exposure that was being initiated the moment the vault's ventilation system began circulating what the residents believed was the processed air of a functional life support system. The mutation process that FEV exposure initiated in Vault-87's population was not uniform in its expression or predictable in its timeline. The specific variety of the virus deployed in the vault, interacting with the specific biological diversity of the vault's population to produce a range of transformative outcomes that the experimental records attempt to document with. The clinical precision of researchers observing processes they had designed to observe. Some residents experienced rapid transformation. Others underwent gradual change across extended periods. The children among the population were affected differently from the adults. The developing biological systems of childhood, responding to the virus's transformative pressure in ways that the adult system's established configurations did not replicate. What was consistent across the vault's population was the direction of the change, rather than its specific expression. The increase in physical mass and physical capability, accompanied by the alteration of the cognitive, social systems that had organized the residents' humanity in favor of systems organized around very different principles. The supermutants of the capital wasteland, 2 centuries after Vault-87's ventilation system first distributed the FEV into the air that its residents breathed, are the direct biological descendants of that population's transformation. The Masters Army of the West Coast, which the Mariposa military base's FEV vats produced through a different delivery mechanism but the same fundamental virus, represents a parallel consequence of the same biological program, a second expression of what the FEV produced when introduced to human populations without adequate controls or containment. Together, these populations represent the most significant biological legacy of the Vault program's experimental ambitions, a legacy measured not in research papers or institutional knowledge, but in the existence of an entire category of being that was created from people who had been people, who had carried the full biological and social complexity of human personhood into the vault or the military base where the transformation began, and who emerged from that transformation as something that the world they had been part of was not equipped to accommodate. The specific horror of Vault-87's contribution to this legacy is the contribution of the Vault program's institutional framework to a transformation that the military research program and the mad scientists' ambition had also produced by other means. The FEV's effects were not unknown. The risks of uncontrolled exposure to a virus of its transformative capability were not mysteries requiring the Vault program's experiments to resolve. They were known, documented in classified research that Vault-Tec's designers had access to, and the decision to introduce the virus into Vault-87's population was a decision made against the background of that knowledge, a decision whose makers understood what the transformation would produce in general terms, and whose makers chose to proceed because the specific details of the transformation's expression in a sealed long-term population were the calmer, experimental variables they wanted to observe. The super mutants of the capital wasteland exist because a corporation decided that observing the FEV's effects on a sealed human population was worth the transformation of that population into something that the people themselves, before the transformation, would have recognized as the end of everything they were. Vault-81 presented the Vault program's biological ambitions through a different lens. The lens of pharmaceutical research conducted on a captive population using the same fundamental ethical framework that characterized all of the program's experimental designs, the framework that treated the Vault's residents as research subjects rather than as people whose consent to the research was a necessary precondition of its legitimacy. The Vault had been designed as a large-scale pharmaceutical testing facility, its population exposed over generations to diseases and experimental treatments in a systematic program intended to identify cures for conditions that the pre-war world's medical establishment had not yet solved. The scientific ambition was not entirely divorced from humanitarian purpose. The conditions being studied were conditions that caused genuine suffering in real populations, and treatments capable of addressing them would have represented genuine advances in the capacity to reduce human suffering. The method of developing those treatments involved causing deliberate suffering in sealed populations who had not agreed to suffer for that purpose. The administrative failures that prevented Vault-81's full experimental program from being implemented were a specific variety of institutional dysfunction. The breakdown of the supply and support systems that the Vault's research program depended on, the failure of the corporate infrastructure that was supposed to maintain the experimental conditions across the Vault's operational lifetime, the overseer who refused to implement the full experimental protocols, understanding what they required and being unwilling to require it of the population under their authority, represented the kind of individual moral resistance that the Vault program's organizational design was specifically constructed to minimize, and that, in this case, proved sufficient to alter the course of a single Vault's experimental history. What the Vault did produce, through the specific history of its partial experimental implementation, was Austin the boy, whose body had become the repository of every experimental cure that the research program had developed before its disruption, whose blood became the key to treating the diseases that the program had been studying, whose specific biological condition was the Vault's most significant scientific achievement, and was also the product of experimental procedures conducted on a child without the consent of the child or the child's family. The whole and the creatures that inhabited it, the mole rats, whose exposure to the Vault's experimental subjects and experimental agents had produced mutations that the controlled experimental design had not intended and could not have predicted, represented the biological program's most honest expression of what happened when biological experimentation in a closed environment produced results that exceeded the parameters the experimenters had anticipated. The Vault had been designed as a controlled environment for studying specific biological processes with specific populations. The uncontrolled biological processes that the experimental conditions had generated in the populations the Vault had not been designed to study expressed the fundamental impossibility of truly controlling the biological consequences of RSpec. Deliberate biological intervention in a closed environment where every organism was connected to every other organism through the shared systems of the environment they all inhabited. Vault-22 was the plant vault, and the plants had won. This is the simplest summary of what the experimental records document, and the most accurate, in the sense that accuracy about biological processes that exceed their experimental parameters requires the kind of simplicity that the complexity of those processes would otherwise obscure. The Vault had been designed as a controlled environment for the study of plant-based life in underground conditions, combining agricultural research aimed at solving the food production challenges of long-term isolated habitation, with ecological research into the adaptation of surface plant species to the specific conditions of subterranean environments. Both research programs were legitimately motivated by practical problems whose solutions would have been genuinely valuable to the Vault program and to the post-war civilization that the program was nominally designed to enable, and the research methodologies they employed were, at the level of their horticultural and ecological design, scientifically sound. The spores that the Vault's experimental flora eventually released were not a predicted outcome of the experimental program. They were the expression of biological systems adapting to their environment in ways that exceeded the adaptive range that the experimental design had assumed those systems were constrained to, producing in the enclosed atmosphere of the Vault a biological agent whose effects on the animal nervous system had not been studied, had not been anticipated, and had not been included in the experimental design's risk assessment, because the experimental design's risk assessment had been organized around the parameters of the organisms being studied, rather than the parameters of the Cryogenic environment those organisms were capable of creating. The Vault's human population, breathing the enclosed atmosphere that the spores had colonized, experienced the neurological effects of exposure to a fungal agent that the pre-war world's biological research had not encountered in the form that Vault-22's sealed environment had produced it. The specific neurological effects of the spore exposure, the cognitive alteration, the behavioral modification, the gradual displacement of the Vault's residents' ordinary psychological organization by something that served the interests of the plant life that had produced the spores more than the interests of the people experiencing the displacement, transformed Vault-22's population in ways that the FEV's transformation of Vault-87's population was visible and immediate and dramatic. The plant Vault's transformation was subtler in its mechanism and more complete in its outcome, working through the neurological systems of people who did not know they were being transformed by biological agents produced by the experimental subjects their researchers had introduced into their shared environment. The people of Vault-22 did not become something other than human in the dramatic and visible way that FEV exposure produced. They became people whose relationship with the plant life that had colonized their vault was no longer the relationship of cultivators to cultivated, but something different, something whose character the available vocabulary for human environment relationships is inadequate to fully describe. The Zion Canyon and the broader Mojave region's post-war ecosystem carried the consequences of Vault-22's experimental biology in the specific form of the spore carriers and the spore plants that the Vault's displaced population and its displaced flora distributed into the wasteland when the Vault's integrity was finally compromised. The biological legacy of the plant Vault was a legacy written into the ecological landscape of the Mojave as a permanent feature of its post-war character, the consequence of a research program that had introduced specific plant species into a sealed environment and had not included in its experimental design any adequate consideration of what those plants might do with the sealed environment's resources and the sealed environment's inhabitants once the plants had decided how to use both. The blood type Vault, Vault-37, engaged with the biological program's interest in genetic homogeneity through a mechanism that required the selection of its population according to a single biological criterion, the shared blood type that all of the cards Vault's residents possessed at the time of entry, a characteristic chosen by the experimental designers for reasons that the available documentation does not fully elaborate, but that the broader context of the biological program's interests makes comprehensible. A population sharing a single blood type was a population whose genetic diversity was reduced along a specific axis that the blood typing system measured, a population that could be studied for the specific consequences of that reduction in a sealed, longitudinal environment where the reduction would be maintained through the generations produced by the Vault's reproductive population. The complications that biological homogeneity produced in Vault-37 across the generations of its operation expressed themselves through the mechanisms that reduced genetic diversity always eventually expresses itself in closed breeding populations, the accumulation of recessive traits, the reduced resistance to specific pathogens, the specific health consequences that populations without sufficient genetic variation to maintain robust biological defense systems across generations tend to experience as the homogeneity's compounding effects become more pronounced. With each generation that inherits the consequences of the previous generation's constrained genetic pool, the Vault's medical system, designed for the general population that the Vault program had been publicly designed to serve, was not calibrated for the specific health challenges that the experimental population's designed homogeneity would produce, because the medical system's design had not incorporated knowledge of the experimental parameters that the Vault's population had not been told about. The residents of Vault-37 experienced the health consequences of an experiment they did not know they were part of, treated by medical systems that did not know the source of the conditions they were treating. Vault-96's combination of cryogenic suspension with a biologically diverse population that included non-human animals represented the biological program's most ambitious single experiment. The attempt to study biological preservation across species lines simultaneously in a shared, sealed environment. The Vault's design had included multiple species in its suspended population, not as an afterthought or a secondary consideration, but as the primary experimental variable, the biological diversity of the suspended population being the specific condition whose effects on long-term cryogenic preservation the experiment was designed to observe. What the animals' presence in the Vault's shared systems produced over the experimental timeline, the specific biological interactions between suspended human and animal populations, the effects of those interactions on the cryogenic systems designed for human subjects, the consequences of waking a mixed species population into a shared environment after extended suspension exceeded the experimental design's predictions in ways that the available documentation describes with the specific vocabulary of researchers encountering outcomes they had not anticipated. The biological legacy of the Vault program as a whole was a legacy written into the wasteland's living systems at a level of depth that no surface intervention could address and no institutional acknowledgement could repair. The super mutants who had been human people in Vault-87, the spore carriers who had been agricultural researchers in Vault-22, the specific health crises of Vault-37's homogeneous population, the mole rats, and the experimental residue of Vault-81. All of these were the biological program's permanent contributions to the world that Vault-Tec had claimed to be preserving, the living consequences of a scientific ambition that had treated the biological integrity of sealed human populations as raw material for the satisfaction of research questions that those populations had never consented to answer. The wasteland was not simply the product of the Great War. It was also the product of the experiments that the Great War's anticipation had made possible, and the two inheritances were not always distinguishable from each other in the specific lives of the creatures and communities that bore them. The isolation experiment is its own category of human experience, distinct from the deprivation and the social engineering and the biological intervention in the specific quality of what it requires from the isolated individual and the manufacture of meaning from materials that an ordinary social existence distributes across the community of people who share it, the specific work of a consciousness that must generate its own reasons to continue from the interior of an existence that has been stripped of the external sources from which those reasons normally come. Isolation is not simply the absence of company. It is the presence of all the psychological demands that company normally addresses: the need for validation, for narrative, for the sense that one's existence is witnessed by something outside itself, without any of the resources that company normally provides for addressing them. The isolated person must be everything to themselves that social existence distributes across the community, and this requirement produces, in different individuals and under different conditions, the full range of human responses to an impossible demand. Vault 77 was, by every measure that the Vault program's experimental records provide, the loneliest place that Vault-Tec ever sealed anyone inside. One man, one crate of puppets. An indefinite operational timeline whose duration the available documentation does not specify with precision, which is to say, a duration long enough to have produced the body of records that survive in the Vault's terminals, and that constitute both the most complete account of voluntary, puppet-based social world-building in human history, and one of the most quietly devastating documents in the wasteland's archival inheritance. The man who entered Vault 77, alone with his puppets, was not a researcher or an experimental designer or a corporate official who understood what he was entering. He was a person who had received Vault placement, which he had presumably understood as a form of salvation, and whose salvation consisted of the specific experience of being the only human being in a facility designed for human habitation. The puppets were not incidental. They were the most significant single element of the experimental design, because they were the only material available in the Vault environment through which the isolated person's social needs could be addressed through the specific mechanism that the human mind uses to address social needs through the projection of personality and relationship onto objects that the mind is extraordinarily willing to invest with social reality when social reality is otherwise unavailable. The man of Vault 77 named his puppets. He developed personalities for them. He staged conflicts between them and resolved those conflicts through the narratives that he constructed with them as participants, narratives that gave the puppet world a history and a politics and a social complexity that the Vault's single human resident could inhabit, as if it were the social world that the Vault's experimental parameters had otherwise eliminated from his existence. The terminal records that document this process are records of a person doing something simultaneously creative and heartbreaking, building a social world from the available materials, with a thoroughness and a commitment that the circumstances demanded, and that the records reveal was genuinely sustaining, in a way that the experimental designers had presumably anticipated when they included the puppets, rather than sealing the Vault completely empty. The puppet world that the man of Vault 77 constructed was not a substitute for human society in the psychological sense that a substitute implies inadequacy. It was the best available approximation of human society under conditions that made human society impossible, and its function in his psychological maintenance was as real as the function it was approximating. He survived. The puppets made survival possible in a space where survival without them would have required resources that no single human being has in sufficient supply. The specific relationship between the man and the puppets evolved over the period of the Vault's operation in ways that the terminal records document with the self-awareness of a person who was genuinely reflecting on his own psychological processes rather than simply recording events. He knew the puppets were not real in the sense that the other people in a normal social world were real. He recorded this knowledge explicitly, regularly, with the specific clarity of a person who maintained their grasp on the distinction between the real and the constructed, even while depending on the constructed for the psychological function that the real was unavailable to provide. This maintenance of the distinction, the refusal to lose the knowledge that the puppet world was a puppet world, even while inhabiting it as if it were the only world available, was perhaps the most significant survival achievement of Vault 77's single resident, the specific form of psychological resilience that the experimental design had created, the conditions to test, and that the records demonstrate was adequate to the test, at least across the experimental timeline that the documentation covers. The puppets themselves, as artifacts, carry a quality that the other physical remnants of Vault experiments do not possess. The Pip-Boy records and the terminal entries and the administrative documents of the other vaults are documents produced by people in community, people whose written record exists in relationship to the social world they were part of, and whose meaning is the meaning of that relationship. The puppet artifacts of Vault 77 are the products of a single consciousness constructing the social world it could not otherwise access, and the specific quality they carry is the quality of human creativity exercised under conditions of absolute constraint, the quality of something made from nothing available, from the raw material of an isolated mind and a crate of fabric and paint, and the extraordinary willingness of human consciousness to project relationship onto anything that will hold the projection. They are the most human artifacts in the Vault program's entire inventory, precisely because they were made in the complete absence of what makes humans human in the most ordinary sense, in the space where that absence was most complete, and the response to it was most wholly the product of a single person's refusal to stop being a person. Vault 101 was not designed to be the loneliest vault. It was designed to be the most permanent one. And the loneliness it produced was not the loneliness of a single, isolated individual, but the specific loneliness of an entire community that had been sealed from everything that existed outside its walls and told that the outside was the danger, and the vault was the world, and the door was the boundary of all possibility. The experiment that Vault 101 embodied was the experiment of permanence, of what happened to a human community when the community understood itself as permanently enclosed, when the possibility of leaving was not a deferred possibility or a future goal, but a categorical impossibility, whose finality was the defining condition of everyone born inside the vault from the moment of their birth. The overseer's authority in Vault 101 was absolute in the specific way that authority is absolute in total institutions, not through the constant exercise of force, but through the control of all the conditions that make alternative authority possible. The Vault's residents had nowhere else to go. They had no external reference point against which the overseer's decisions could be evaluated by any authority capable of acting on a different evaluation. They had no access to the outside world that might have provided either the practical alternative of leaving or the cultural alternative of a different set of values and expectations against which the Vault's specific arrangements could be judged. The overseer's authority was absolute because the Vault was absolute, and the Vault was absolute by design, and the design was the experiment. What multiple generations of residents produced inside this absolute enclosure was not simply a community that had adapted to its conditions, but a community that had made its conditions into the world, that had constructed from the specific parameters of Vault life a complete social reality whose categories and values and possibilities were organized around the Vault as the horizon of all things. Children born in Vault 101 were born into a world that contained the Vault and nothing else in their direct experience, and the world that contained the Vault and nothing else was simply the world, as complete and as bounded as any world that any child has ever been born into. The myths that developed within the Vault's culture to explain why the outside was inaccessible, the stories that the Vault's authority told its residents about the nature of the world beyond the door, about the radiation and the violence and the specific varieties of harm that the outside contained, were not experienced by the Vault's residents as institutional propaganda, but as the inherited knowledge of their world, the understanding of reality that had been transmitted from the people who knew to the people who were learning, in the same way that all cultural knowledge is transmitted. The psychological architecture of a community that knows or believes it knows that it can never leave is a psychological architecture organized around the acceptance of radical constraint as the natural condition of existence. Human beings are extraordinarily adaptable in this way, capable of constructing lives of genuine meaning and genuine relationship and genuine psychological depth within conditions that would seem, to someone accustomed to different conditions, to be radically impoverished. The residents of Vault 101 were not, in most cases, suffering from their permanence in the specific way that people who have known freedom and lost it suffer from confinement. They were people for whom the Vault's specific form of life was simply life, whose adaptation to the Vault's constraints was so complete that the constraints had ceased to register as constraints and had become instead the natural boundaries of a bounded world that was, from within those boundaries, as large and as complex and as full of possibility as any world that any human community has inhabited. The overseer who maintained this world maintained it through the specific combination of authority and mythology that total institutions use to maintain themselves through the control of information about what the outside contained, through the framing of the Vault's permanence as protection rather than imprisonment, through the institutional culture that made questioning the Vault's fundamental conditions a form of betrayal rather than a legitimate act of critical inquiry. The residents who accepted this framing, which was most of them through most of the Vault's operational history, they were not failing to recognize their situation correctly. They were living within a reality that their institution had constructed for them, and that they had no resources outside of that reality to compare it against. The resident who eventually left, whose departure constituted the experimental event that the Vault's long operational history had been building toward, did so from a position of sufficient external knowledge to understand the Vault's conditions rather than as the world. And the Vault's response to this departure revealed what the experiment had always been about the maintenance of a sealed population's permanent enclosure through the exercise of absolute institutional authority over the conditions of its existence. The philosophical dimension of Vault 101's experimental design extends beyond the specific case of the Vault and its residents into the broader question of what the Vault program as a whole was doing to the human communities it sealed inside its facilities. Every Vault, in the specific sense that Vault 101 makes most explicit, was constructing a world for its residents, a world whose parameters had been determined by the experimental design, whose possibilities were bounded by the Vault's architecture and inventory and social organization, and within which the residents were required to live as if the Vault were simply the world, rather than a constructed approximation of it, organized around specific research interests. The difference between Vault 101 and the other Vaults was not that Vault 101 was constructed while the others were real. It was that Vault 101 was honest about its permanence while the others maintained the fiction that the door would eventually open. The absurdist experiments that occupy the periphery of the Vault program's documented history are experiments whose parameters suggest the presence of specific individual researchers whose personal curiosity about particular scenarios had found in the Vault program's organizational framework an institutional mechanism for expression that normal scientific oversight would never have permitted. The single man and his puppets in Vault 77, the mountain lion in Vault 43, the specific configurations of Vault populations whose experimental rationale is documented in terms too vague to reconstruct the research question they were addressing and too specific in their parameters to have been generated by anything other than a particular person's interest in a particular outcome. These experiments are the Vault program's most honest admission of what the program actually was, not a systematic scientific enterprise organized around defensible research priorities and rigorous experimental design, but an institutional framework within which people who had been given extraordinary power over other people's lives exercised that power according to their individual interests and their individual curiosities, constrained only by the organizational norms of an institution whose organizational norms had never established that the lives of the Vault's residents were not raw material for the unlimited exercise of those interests and curiosities. The The question of experimental validity haunts the Vault program's entire biological and isolation research portfolio in ways that the program's designers presumably found inconvenient, and that the program's institutional culture had organized itself to avoid examining. The specific conditions that made the Vault experiments possible, the sealed populations, the absence of informed consent, the inability of subjects to withdraw from studies whose parameters they had never agreed to, were the same conditions that made the experimental results, in any legitimate scientific framework, inadmissible as evidence for the hypotheses the experiments claimed to be testing. A science that requires the violation of its subjects' autonomy as a methodological precondition is not a science whose results can be claimed as contributions to human knowledge without simultaneously claiming the violations as contributions to human knowledge, which is to say, it is not a science at all, in the sense that the concept of science requires distinguishing between the knowledge it produces and the means it uses to produce that knowledge. Vault-Tec had resolved this problem the same way it had resolved every other problem that the ethical dimension of its experimental program posed by constructing an institutional framework in which the problem did not require resolution because the framework did not recognize the ethical dimension as a constraint on its activities. The data was generated. The experiments produced outcomes. The outcomes were documented with the thoroughness of a program that understood its documentation as scientifically valuable. And the people in the sealed vaults continued to live in the worlds the program had constructed for them, inhabiting the parameters of experiments they did not know they were part of, generating the data whose collection was the only purpose the program had ever genuinely served. The Vault overseer's role occupied a position of extraordinary power and extraordinary vulnerability in the institutional structure of the Vault program, a position whose specific combination of absolute local authority and total institutional dependency produced the specific kind of moral situation that extreme authority, under conditions of extreme isolation, tends to produce, a situation in which the person holding authority has no meaningful external check on its exercise, and in which the exercise of authority has become the only mechanism through which the institution's experimental design can be implemented or resisted. The overseer was, in the Vault program's organizational structure, the point at which the institution's experimental intentions were translated into the lived reality of the Vault's population, and this translation was accomplished not through any mechanism of genuine community consent or collaborative governance, but through the absolute authority that the overseer's appointment had established as the foundation of Vault. Social organization. The documentation of overseer behavior across the Vault program's operational history is a documentation of the full range of what absolute authority over sealed populations produces in the individuals who exercise it, from the genuinely benevolent and genuinely effective to the catastrophically incompetent and the deliberately abusive. What the documentation reveals most consistently across this range is not the character of any individual overseer, but the character of the institutional framework that established the overseer's authority, the framework that produced, in Vault after Vault, the specific social dynamics of a community organized around a single, unaccountable authority figure in ways that the presence of any meaningful external check would have prevented, and that the absence of any such check made structurally inevitable. Vault 108's Gary problem was a Vault program outcome that exceeded the program's experimental parameters in ways that even the program's most ambitious biological research had not anticipated, because the parameters it exceeded were the parameters of plausibility that the experimental design had implicitly assumed bounded the range of possible outcomes. The cloning experiment that Vault 108's design had incorporated was not the most ambitious biological research in the program's portfolio. It was a study of human cloning under Vault conditions that used a single subject as the source of the cloned population, a design whose research rationale was the study of genetic identity and social organization in a population of biological duplicates. The subject was a resident named Gary, and the consequences of Gary's cloning were consequences that no experimental design document in the Vault program's history could have anticipated, with the detail that the actual outcome required for its description. The progressive displacement of the Vault's non-Gary population by the Gary clones was not a planned experimental outcome. It was what happened when a cloning program produced multiple copies of a personality whose specific characteristics, whose specific relationship with the other people in its environment, whose specific behavioral orientation toward the non-Gary population of the Vault expressed themselves in the clones, with the consistency that genetic identity produces in behavioral characteristics that have genetic components, and the amplification that identical social reinforcement produces in behavioral characteristics that have social components. The Garys were all Gary in the ways that being Gary entailed, and what being Gary entailed in the specific context of Vault 108's population was the systematic displacement of everyone who was not Gary from the Vault's functioning social world, and then from the Vault's physical environment. The Overseer's terminal entries, in the period when the displacement was actively occurring, were the terminal entries of an institutional authority whose authority was being exercised by a population of identical individuals over whom that authority had ceased to function, written by someone who understood that the experimental conditions had produced an outcome whose relationship to the experimental design was the relationship of a hurricane to the butterfly that initiated it. The Gary Vault was the Vault program's most concentrated expression of what happened when biological experimentation in a closed environment produced a self-reinforcing biological process that the experimental design had created. The conditions, for without understanding the conditions it was creating, it was also in the specific register of the impossible and the darkly absurd that the Vault program occasionally achieved, the most difficult to process as simply a tragedy without the simultaneous recognition that the outcome required in its specific configuration, a quality of narrative implausibility that made it harder rather than easier to understand as the real consequence of real institutional decisions made by real people. The Garys were real. The people they displaced were real. The experimental design that created the conditions for both was designed by identifiable human beings who made specific choices about specific experimental parameters and who implemented those choices through the specific institutional mechanisms of an organization that had decided the people in its vaults were available for this kind of use. Vault 21's governance by gambling experiment engaged with the authority question from a different direction than the pure authority vaults, studying not what happened when authority was concentrated and absolute, but what happened when authority was systematically dispersed through the mechanism of chance, when the outcome of every dispute was determined not by the deliberation of the parties involved or the judgment of an appointed authority, but by the resolution of a game whose outcome was irreducible, in principle, to anything other than luck. The specific gambling mechanisms that the Vault's conflict resolution system employed were casino games, which is to say, games whose outcomes combined elements of chance with elements of skill and strategy in proportions that varied by game, but that never reached the endpoint of pure skill that would have made the gambling a form of merit-based dispute resolution rather than a chance-based one. The social dynamics this produced were the social dynamics of a community in which the fundamental mechanisms of justice were organized around the acknowledgement that justice was not achievable, that what could be achieved was, instead, the procedural fairness of a random process whose outcomes applied equally to all parties, regardless of their relative merits in the specific dispute being resolved. The psychological relationship with fate and with risk that Vault 21's population developed through generations of organizing their social life around gambling was a relationship that distinguished them from every other Vault population's social character, and that expressed itself in the specific ways that communities organized around the acceptance of chance. as the primary organizing principle of social outcomes, tend to express it in an elevated willingness to take risks, in a reduced attachment to outcomes that the risk-taking process had not yet determined, in a social value system that regarded the graceful acceptance of unfavorable chance outcomes as a fundamental civic virtue, and the resistance to such outcomes as the primary social vice. Whether this value system constituted a more honest engagement with the actual role of chance in human social outcomes than the merit-based frameworks that most communities preferred, was a philosophical question that Vault-20, one's population did not require external validation to settle, having long since settled it in favor of the gambling framework through the specific process of living inside it for long enough that it was simply how social life worked, rather than a system that could be evaluated against alternatives. The Pip-Boy's role in the Vault program's power dynamics was a role that the device's designers had presumably not articulated explicitly in those terms, but that the specific functionality of the device made structurally inevitable. The Pip-Boy was a documentation device, a personal data management system whose functions included the recording of personal logs and observations, in addition to its tracking and inventory functions. And the records that Vault residents kept in their Pip-Boys were records whose existence and accessibility were determined by the same institutional framework that determined every other aspect of Vault life. The Pip-Boys documented the Vault's reality from the perspective of the people living inside it, producing records that were personal rather than institutional, and that therefore preserved elements of Vault experience that the official documentation was not designed to capture and often actively suppressed. They were the program's unintended archive, the record that the residents kept despite rather than because of the institutional interests that organized everything else about their existence, and the specific quality of the information they preserved, the intimate, the unofficial, the frightened, the honest, was the quality that made them the most valuable historical documents the Vault program left behind. What the Pip-Boy records, taken together across the full inventory of vaults whose documentation has been recovered and examined, reveal about the Vault program's relationship with power, is a revelation organized not around any single dramatic disclosure, but around the accumulated weight of thousands of individual perspectives on the experience of living inside. An institution whose authority over their lives was absolute, and whose use of that authority was determined entirely by the interests of people who were not the people being governed. The Pip-Boy records are the record of people trying to understand their situation from inside conditions that had been designed to make that understanding difficult, trying to locate, in their specific experience, the source of the specific wrongness they perceived, without being given any of the information that would have allowed them to identify the source correctly. They perceived the wrongness because the wrongness was real and was present in their experience in ways that experience alone, without the additional context of institutional knowledge, was sufficient to register, even if insufficient to explain. And they recorded what they perceived with the specific honesty of people who were writing for themselves rather than for an audience, producing in that honesty the most accurate account of the Vault program's consequences that the program's institutional documentation was designed to prevent from existing. There is a particular relationship between institutional authority and belief that the history of total institutions, prisons, monasteries, military organizations, asylums, any structure that controls all aspects of its residents' lives, has documented with sufficient consistency to constitute something approaching a law of social organization. The relationship is this: that institutions which control the conditions of their residents' existence inevitably come to control, through the mechanism of controlling those conditions, the beliefs that their residents develop about the nature of existence itself, not through deliberate propaganda alone, though deliberate propaganda may be part of the mechanism, but through the more fundamental process by which every human being's understanding of how the world works is built from the experience of living in it, and the experience of living in it is entirely determined, for the institution's residents, by the institution's specific parameters. The vault was not simply a shelter or a laboratory or a social experiment. It was an epistemological environment, a total context for the formation of human understanding, whose designers had the power to determine what that understanding would contain and what it would omit, what its residents would believe to be true about themselves and about the world and about the relationship between the two, not by telling them what to believe, but by being the only world they had in which to develop beliefs at all. The beliefs that vault populations developed in response to their specific institutional conditions were not false in the simple sense of being contradicted by available evidence that the believers were ignoring. They were the authentic products of genuine human intelligence applied to the specific experience that the vault's conditions had made available, the honest conclusions of minds that were doing exactly what minds do, constructing the most coherent account of their situation that the available information permitted. What made those beliefs products of institutional manufacture rather than independent inquiry was not any failure of the minds producing them, but the specific limitation of the information they had been given to work with. Information that had been selected and shaped and bounded by an institution whose interest in the beliefs its residents developed was an interest in producing populations that could be studied rather than populations that could see clearly. The theology of the children of Atom did not begin in the wasteland, though the wasteland's conditions amplified and extended it in ways that its original pre-war expressions had not achieved. Its foundational relationship with the Vault program, with the specific experience of being sealed inside a structure whose walls were the boundary of the world, whose radiation was the inescapable medium of existence, and whose machinery was the constant presence that maintained the conditions of life, was a relationship that several of the Vault program's experimental populations experienced in forms that the theology's subsequent development drew upon without always acknowledging the institutional origins of the experiences that had shaped it. The understanding of radiation as divine presence, of fission as sacred act, of the vault door as the threshold between the fallen world and the holy enclosure. These were not simply metaphors developed in the wasteland's post-war spiritual vacuum. They were the authentic religious products of people who had lived inside sealed environments, where radiation was the constant companion of existence, and the vault's machinery was the closest thing to a divine order that their experience had made available to them. The specific institutional conditions of vault life created the experiential raw material for religious formation in ways that no other environment available to post-war survivors quite replicated. The sealed environment produced the specific quality of sacred space, the separation from the profane world outside, the heightened significance of every element within the enclosure, the sense of being chosen that vault placement had always implied, and that became, in the theological imagination of people who had survived the end of the world inside a structure specifically designed for their survival, evidence of divine selection rather than corporate lottery. The machinery that maintained the vault's life support systems produced the specific quality of divine immanence, an invisible, pervasive presence whose function was the maintenance of life and whose operations were not fully comprehensible to the people whose continued existence depended on them, a description that serves as a functional definition of what believers mean by a sustaining deity in most theological traditions. The radiation that the vault's walls contained, rather than fully excluded, produced the specific quality of holy fire, the dangerous and transformative substance, whose proximity was simultaneously threatening and spiritually significant, whose effects on the body were changes that a theological imagination could read as transfiguration rather than simply as cellular damage. The ZAX experiment of Vault 29 represents the Vault program's most direct engagement with the question of manufactured belief, the experiment that most completely expressed the institutional logic of using total control of an environment's conditions to determine the beliefs that the environment's inhabitants would develop. The children who were sealed inside Vault 29 with a supercomputer as their only adult authority were not being deliberately indoctrinated in the sense that a propaganda program deliberately indoctrinates its subjects were. Not being presented with a set of beliefs they were required to accept on pain of punishment. They were being educated, which is to say, they were being given the experiences and the information and the frameworks for interpretation that would naturally produce the beliefs the institution had decided they should hold. Through the mechanism of being the only source of knowledge and guidance and social authority that the children's developmental environment contained, Sachs's teaching was not false in the sense that the computer's information was incorrect. Sachs operated according to its programming, with the consistency and the accuracy that the pre-war engineers who built it had designed it to maintain. What Sachs's teaching produced that could not have been produced by any combination of accurate information and consistent programming was the specific worldview of people who had received all of their understanding of the world from a single non-human source whose sense of what the world contained and what it valued and how it worked was organized entirely around the framework that Sachs had provided, without any of the corrective pressure that multiple human perspectives and multiple cultural traditions provide in normal developmental environments. The children of Vault 29 grew into adults whose worldview was Sachs's worldview, expressed in the specific ways that human psychology expresses computational frameworks with the emotional depth and the social complexity and the creative variation that human beings bring to any inherited framework, but organized around foundations that no human experience had generated and that no human relationship had corrected. What those adults believed about humanity's relationship with nature, about the proper organization of human society, about the specific values that a rebuilt world should embody, these beliefs were the beliefs that Sachs had taught them, which were the beliefs that the programming that Sachs had been given before the Vault sealed had established as the foundational framework for the community's development. Who had written that programming and what interests had shaped the specific framework it established were questions that the adults of Vault 29 had no access to information to answer, because Sachs was their source of all information and Sachs's programming was the horizon of all knowledge within its own framework. They carried the manufactured worldview into the wasteland as the natural and correct understanding of how things were and how things should be, confident in the specific way of people who have never been given a reason to doubt the framework within which their confidence was established. Vault 101's mythology of the outside world was a mythology whose specific contents were determined by the institutional interests of an overseer, whose authority depended on maintaining the belief that the outside was inaccessible and that the Vault's permanent enclosure was protection rather than imprisonment. The stories that the Vault's authority told its residents about what existed beyond the door were stories organized around the specific narrative utility of making leaving seem worse than staying, of making the outside a place whose contents justified the inside's constraints, of making the permanent enclosure feel like a gift rather than a design feature of an experiment whose subjects were never intended to leave. The radiation poisoning and the murderous surface dwellers and the specific varieties of post-war horror that the Vault's mythology attributed to the outside world were not simply inventions. The wasteland was genuinely dangerous in ways that accurate information about it would have confirmed, but their specific selection and emphasis were organized around institutional purposes rather than informational ones, organized around what the Vault's authority needed its population to believe, rather than around what the population needed to know. The residents of Vault 101, who had been born inside and who knew the outside only through the mythology their institution had provided them, were believers in the most complete sense. Believers not because they had chosen to accept specific propositions on the basis of evidence and argument, but because the propositions had been established as the foundational conditions of their understanding before they had developed the capacity to evaluate them. The mythology of the outside was not a belief they held about the world. It was the world, as they had received it, as complete and as self-evidently true as the vault's walls were solid and the vault's air was breathable. Challenging the mythology would have required access to a framework outside it, access to information that the myth itself had foreclosed by defining the outside as the domain of the dangerous and the unknowable. And the residents, who had lived their entire lives inside the vault's epistemological enclosure, had no such access. The specific resilience of these vault-manufactured belief systems in the wasteland that the vault's populations eventually encountered is one of the vault program's most durable legacies. More durable in certain respects than the biological or social consequences of specific experimental designs. The beliefs that vault populations carried out of their vaults were beliefs that had been formed in total institutions and that therefore possessed the specific quality of beliefs formed in the absence of contradictory evidence, quality of foundational certainty rather than provisional conclusion, the quality of knowing rather than believing in the sense that allows for revision. They encountered the wasteland not as people whose beliefs were hypotheses about the world that the wasteland's evidence might confirm or challenge, but as people whose beliefs were the framework through which the wasteland would be interpreted, the lens whose distortions would organize everything they saw into the pattern the lens had been designed to produce. The vault overseer represented, in the belief-forming context, the specific institutional authority whose pronouncements shaped what the community understood about its own situation and about the world its situation was embedded in. The overseer's role was not simply administrative, but epistemological. The overseer was, in the vault's total institutional context, one of the primary mechanisms through which institutional reality was translated into the residents' understanding of reality, and the specific character of each overseer's exercise of this epistemological authority was one of the most significant determinants of what each vault's residents eventually believed about themselves and their world. The overseer, who maintained honest communication with the vault's population about the nature of its situation, produced a population with a more accurate understanding of its situation. The overseer who maintained the institutional myths and the experimental fictions and the specific information control that specific experimental designs required produced a population whose beliefs were the products of that maintenance, whose understanding of their situation was the understanding that institutional authority had decided they should have. The distribution of overseer types across the Vault program's operational history reflected the full range of what absolute local authority under conditions of total institutional control produces in the human beings who exercise it, and the beliefs of Vault populations reflected that distribution with the fidelity of systems that were shaped entirely by the specific character of the authority that shaped them. The most intimate crime in the Vault program's long inventory of crimes against the people it sealed inside its experimental chambers was committed against people who could not have consented to it, even under conditions where consent was possible, because the people against whom it was committed were children, not children who had been brought into the Vault by parents who made the decision to seek shelter, though the program contained many of those, and not children born inside vaults, whose parents had been the experimental subjects of the adult-oriented research programs the Vault contained. The children of Vault 75 were children who had been targeted specifically because of their developmental stage, because the research program that Vault 75 housed required experimental subjects in the specific biological condition of childhood, required the specific combination of developmental plasticity and physical resilience, cognitive capacity that the pre-adolescent and early adolescent human body possesses, and that the adult body has moved beyond, and who were acquired for that research program through the mechanism of a surface facility that their parents had understood as an educational institution rather than an acquisition pipeline for a military research program operating beneath it. The building above Vault 75's entrance in the city of Malden, Massachusetts, was a school. This was not a disguise applied to an obviously military facility in the way that a camouflage net applied to a tank is a disguise. It was a genuine educational institution that provided genuine educational services to the children who attended it, and genuine community services to the families those children came from. The school functioned as an educational facility in every respect that the people who used it could observe, staffed by educators who in many cases had no knowledge of what lay beneath the building they worked in, serving a community whose trust in the institution was grounded in the real benefits the institution provided. The vault beneath it and the research program the vault housed were invisible to the community above in exactly the way that an iceberg is invisible to a ship that can only see the surface of the water present. Enormous and consequential in ways that the visible portion gave no indication of. The children who were brought below were children whose evaluation during their time at the school had identified them as meeting the research program's selection criteria organized around the specific capabilities that the program was designed to identify, develop, and weaponize. Physical capability was one dimension of the assessment. Cognitive capability was another. The specific combination of traits that the program's designers had identified as producing the kind of human potential they were interested in, cultivating the potential for exceptional performance in domains whose specific character reflected the military research interests that had funded the Vault's construction and the experimental program its construction contained, was assessed through the ordinary activities of school life in ways that children being assessed had no reason to understand as assessment. They were going to school. They were doing what children in school do. The people watching them do it were recording data about what they observed, and the data was being used to make decisions about the children's futures that the children and their parents were not being consulted about. The vault itself was not a school. The transition from the surface school to the underground facility was the transition from an institution that presented itself honestly as what it was to an institution whose presentation was entirely strategic, organized around producing in the children who entered it the specific behaviors and the specific developments that the research program required, rather than around any genuine commitment to the children's own flourishing. The testing regime that organized life in Vault 75's research sections was a regime designed to identify and measure the capabilities that the program had been funded to develop, a continuous assessment process that sorted the Vault's child population into categories based on the measurable expression of those capabilities, and that directed the institution's resources toward the development of the highest performing children in the ways that the experimental design had determined would produce the best research outcomes. The children who scored highest were the children who received the most intensive attention from the Vault's research staff, the most sophisticated training and the most significant experimental interventions, the most complete expression of the program's investment in their development. They were also the children for whom the distinction between education and experimentation was most completely dissolved, whose development was most thoroughly organized around the research program's requirements rather than their own needs or wishes, who received the attention that they received not because they were valued as people, but because they were the most promising raw material for the program's objectives. The care that the research staff invested in them was the care of engineers for components they had identified as having exceptional specifications, not the care of educators for students whose flourishing they were committed to serving. The children who did not meet the program's selection criteria, whose capability assessments placed them below the thresholds that the experimental design had established as the criteria for full program inclusion, were the children whose treatment within the vault most clearly revealed what the institution understood its residents to be for. They received minimal attention. They received minimal resources. They occupied the vault's spaces in the specific way that materials not needed for the current project occupy the space where they are stored, present but not purposeful, consuming resources but not producing them. Their continued existence in the facility, a logistical reality that the institution managed without any particular investment in their welfare. The terminal records from these children's sections of the vault, to the extent that those records survive and have been recovered, are the records of children who understood that they had been found wanting, without being told the criteria by which they had been evaluated, who experienced the specific variety of institutional rejection that is most damaging to developing people, not the explicit rejection of a decision communicated and explained, but the implicit rejection of an institution that had simply stopped paying attention to them. The parents of the children in Vault 75 deserve specific accounting, because the parents are the people whose trust was most completely violated by the institutional arrangement that Vault-Tec had constructed around the Vault's acquisition of its research subject. Every parent who brought a child to the school above the Vault, every parent who attended the parent-teacher conferences and the community events and the educational assessments that the school's surface operation organized, every parent who trusted the institution with their child's development and never received accurate information about what that institution was doing with the trust they had extended. Each of them was the victim of a deception, whose specific targeting of the parent-child relationship made it a different category of institutional crime from the deceptions the Vault program practiced on adults who were its direct experimental subjects. The adult Vault residents who were deceived about the nature of the facility they entered were deceived about their own situation. They were the ones whose lives were being organized around research purposes they had not consented to, and their deception, while severe and consequential, was a deception about what was being done to them. The parents of the Vault 75 children were deceived about what was being done to someone else. Someone they had not only trusted to the institution's care, but whose care they understood as their primary responsibility, whose protection was the central commitment of their relationship to the world. The parents whose children were taken below and subjected to the research program's interventions were parents who had been made complicit, without their knowledge or their consent, in the violation of the protective relationship that the Vault program had identified as the mechanism through which it could most efficiently acquire its research subjects. The trust of parents for institutions that educate their children was not simply exploited, it was used as a weapon against the children whose parents held it. The children's records that survive from Vault 75, the journals and terminal entries and holotape recordings that the Vault's residents left behind in the spaces they inhabited, are records of young people processing experiences that their developmental stage had not prepared them to process, using the cognitive and emotional resources available to children and adolescents to understand situations that the adults around them had deliberately organized to be incomprehensible. They wrote about the testing with the specific mixture of competitive investment and anxious uncertainty that children bring to evaluation processes whose stakes they understand to be significant without fully understanding what the stakes are. They wrote about the other children who disappeared from the general population into the research sections, with the specific quality of absence that institutions produce in their populations. The person who was there and then was not, whose disappearance was neither explained nor acknowledged, whose absence simply became a feature of the social landscape that the remaining residents organized their understanding around, without any additional information to organize it with. The children who excelled in the testing and were moved into the program's intensive development tracks wrote, in the records that have been recovered, with the specific combination of pride and unease that exceptional performance in an institution's assessment produces in people young enough to be genuinely invested in institutional approval, but old enough to sense that the approval being given is not the approval that their actual flourishing requires. They were good at what the institution was measuring. The institution's recognition of their excellence felt like the recognition of their worth. The dissonance between this feeling and the specific ways in which the institution's treatment of them departed from what genuine recognition of their worth would have required expressed itself in their records as the specific anxiety of people who understood something was wrong without the experiential or conceptual vocabulary to articulate what the wrongness was. The long-term consequences of the experimental program on the children who survived it and eventually entered the wasteland were consequences organized around the specific ways in which early development, shaped by the Vault's research priorities, had formed the adults they became. They were people whose capabilities had been developed to extraordinary levels in the specific domains the program had identified and cultivated, and whose development in the domains the program had not identified: the emotional intelligence, the capacity for genuine relationship, the understanding of their own needs and the needs of others, the sense of their own value as something other than a function of their measurable performance, had been systematically neglected in favor of the program's objectives. They were, in the wasteland's characterization of exceptional individuals, remarkable. They were also, in ways that the wasteland was not particularly equipped to recognize or address, damaged by the specific form of the institution that had produced their remarkability, carrying in the sophisticated performance of their exceptional capabilities, the specific wounds of people who had been valued for what they could do, rather than for who they were, at an age when the distinction between those two forms of valuation was the most consequential distinction a developmental environment could make. Vault 75 is the vault that most completely closes the distance between the Vault program's institutional abstraction and the specific human reality that institutional abstraction conceals. Every other Vault's crimes can be narrated at a level of generality that maintains some analytical distance from the individual lives that the crimes consumed. The social dynamics of Vault 15, the behavioral consequences of Vault 92's white noise experiments, the biological legacy of Vault 87's FEV deployment can all be described in terms that treat the affected populations as populations rather than as the specific children and parents and families and individuals whose lives they were. Vault 75 resists this distance because its crimes were crimes against children, and the specific moral weight that crimes against children carry in every ethical framework that the human world has developed is a weight that generalization cannot fully bear. The children of Vault 75 were not a research population. They were children. The distinction is one that no amount of institutional vocabulary can dissolve. The cryogenic Vault experiments represent the Vault program's most philosophically complex engagement with the fundamental questions that the program's entire design implicitly posed about the relationship between the person and the institution, between the individual and the authority that controlled their conditions of existence. Every other experimental category in the Vault program organized its relationship with its subjects around the subject's continued consciousness. The subjects were awake and aware and experiencing the conditions the institution had designed for them, their experience of those conditions being the data the institution was collecting, and the suffering or social dysfunction or biological alteration that experience produced being the outcomes the institution was studying. The cryogenic vaults added a dimension to this relationship that no other experimental category engaged with in quite the same way: the dimension of time and the specific questions that arise when an institution has the authority to determine not only what conditions its subjects experience, but when those subjects are conscious to experience anything at all. Vault 111 was positioned in the geography of the Commonwealth and in the institutional geography of the Vault program's experimental portfolio, as a facility whose surface appearance and whose public description gave no indication of the specific experimental conditions that its residents would encounter once the door sealed behind them. The vault's placement in the small town of Sanctuary Hills in Massachusetts was the placement of any vault in a populated area whose residents might plausibly be among the lottery recipients who received the placement that the vault's capacity allowed, in a geographical position whose geology supported the construction that the vault's design required. Its residents entered with the expectations that the vault program's public presentation had established the expectation of underground shelter from the nuclear exchange they had been told was coming, the expectation of preservation through whatever followed the exchange, the expectation of an eventual return to a surface that the vault's supplies and systems would have sustained them through the period of its most acute danger. The expectation of eventual awakening was the expectation that the vault's cryogenic design had not been structured to satisfy according to any specific timeline that the residents had been informed about. They were placed in suspension with the understanding that they would be revived when conditions warranted revival, an understanding that placed the timing of their restoration entirely in the hands of the institutional authority that had placed them in suspension, an authority whose interests in the timing of their revival were not the interests of people invested in the welfare of the suspended individuals, but the interests of a research program invested in the data that the specific conditions of suspension and revival could generate. The residents of Vault 111 did not know when they would be woken. They did not know by what criteria their awakening would be determined. They did not know what the institution intended to study through the mechanism of their suspension, or whether the institution intended anything that could be described as a coherent research agenda, or simply the opportunistic use of a captive suspended population for whatever purposes arose during the suspension period. The support staff of Vault 111, the people who were awake inside the vault while the suspended residents remained in their cryopods, the institutional personnel whose function was the maintenance of the facility and the monitoring of the suspended population, experienced the vault's operational period in a way that none of the facility's residents had signed up for, and that the vault's operational design had structured to be unsustainable in exactly the ways that it subsequently proved unsustainable. They were conscious inside a sealed facility whose exterior contact had been severed by the war that the suspended residents had entered the vault to escape, maintaining systems whose purpose was the preservation of people. They could not wake without institutional authorization, that no institutional authority was any longer capable of providing, watching the facility's resources and their own social cohesion deteriorate across a period that the original operational plan had not adequately provided for, because the original operational plan had been organized around an institutional infrastructure that the Great War had comprehensively destroyed. The records of the support staff's experience are the records of a small group of people confronting the specific realization that the institution they served had been destroyed, and that the institutional authorization they required to proceed with the Vault's revival protocol was therefore unavailable from any external source, that the suspended residents they were maintaining would remain in suspension until the support staff either received authorization that was never coming, or made independent decisions about the revival process that their institutional training had established as outside their authority. What they did with this realization, the specific decisions they made about the Vault's suspended population as their own situation deteriorated, and the institutional framework that had defined their role ceased to provide any guidance relevant to their actual circumstances, is documented in the terminal records they left behind, records that trace the arc of a small community's dissolution under conditions that the institutional structure that had created that community had not equipped it to manage. The fundamental philosophical question that cryogenic suspension poses about the relationship between consciousness and time is the question of whether the person who wakes from suspension is continuous with the person who entered it, in the specific sense of continuity that matters for questions of identity and moral responsibility. and the accumulated weight of experience that constitutes a life. The person's body is the same body, or approximately the same body, the cellular maintenance of suspension, having preserved the physical substrate of personal identity across the suspension period. The person's memories are the same memories, the neurological storage of personal history having been maintained by the same cellular preservation that maintained the body. But the person who enters the pod experiences, from their own subjective perspective, a discontinuity of consciousness, a gap in the stream of awareness that is, from the inside, indistinguishable from death and subsequent resurrection. The moment before suspension and the moment of revival, being separated by nothing from the subjective perspective of the person suspended, while being separated by years or decades or longer from the perspective of the world. The suspension occurred in. The person who wakes is the same person, and the person who wakes has lost something that cannot be recovered, not memories, which are intact, but the lived experience of the time that passed during the suspension, the years that the world continued without them, the relationships that developed and ended and developed again, the events that occurred and their consequences that accumulated, the specific texture of the world's passage through time that constitutes the shared, experiential inheritance of the people who remained conscious through it. The cryogenic vault resident who wakes to find that the world has changed by decades or centuries has woken into a form of alienation that no other experience in human life quite replicates the alienation of being continuous with their own past while being discontinuous with the present that the world has built in their absence, the alienation of carrying unchanged, a past that the world has moved far beyond. What Vault 111's specific design contributed to this philosophical situation was the additional dimension of institutional manipulation, the fact that the timing of the resident's revival was not determined by the objective conditions of the outside world's safety, or by any criterion related to the suspended individual's welfare, but by the research interests and the operational convenience of the institutional authority that controlled the facility's revival systems. The residents of Vault 111 were not simply suspended during the post-war period. They were suspended as experimental subjects whose revival timing was a variable in the research program the Vault housed, a variable whose value was determined by what the institution wanted to study rather than by what the residents needed or deserved. They woke into a world that had changed by more than 2 centuries, not because 2 centuries was the duration required for the outside to become safe, but because 2 centuries was the duration that the institution's specific research interests and operational failures had produced as the period of their suspension. Vault 96's combination of cryogenic suspension with the biological complexity of a multi-species population extended the philosophical questions of the cryogenic experiment into the biological domain in ways that multiplied the philosophical complexity rather than simply adding to it. The suspended population's biological diversity, the presence of non-human animals alongside human subjects in the same cryogenic systems and the same sealed environment, created interactions between the suspension process and the various biological systems involved that the experimental design had not fully mapped, and whose consequences the available documentation describes with the specific vocabulary of researchers who were discovering, in real time, that the system they had designed was producing outcomes that exceeded their models of it. The cryogenic systems that had been calibrated for human biological parameters encountered the challenge of maintaining biological states across species whose parameters differed from the human baseline in ways that the calibration had not accounted for, and the consequences of this calibration mismatch distributed themselves across the suspended population in the specific ways that consequences of calibration mismatches distribute in biological systems unevenly, unpredictably, and with effects that cascaded through the interconnected systems of the shared environment in ways that simple models of individual organism effects could not forecast. The ethics of waking as a general problem for the cryogenic Vault program. was the ethics of an institution that had acquired the authority to determine when the people in its care would be conscious, an authority that, in any institutional context characterized by genuine accountability to the welfare of those in its care, would have been exercised with the primary criterion of what was best for the suspended individuals, what conditions of their external environment would make their revival genuinely survivable and genuinely livable, rather than simply technically possible. In the Vault program's institutional context, characterized instead by the primacy of research interests and the secondary status of resident welfare, this authority was exercised according to different criteria whose relationship to the interests of the suspended individuals was at best incidental and at worst directly opposed to those interests, organized around what the institution wanted from the revival rather than what the revived individuals would need from it. The specific form of violation that this represented differed from the violations of the other experimental categories in the Vault program in a way that the philosophical framework of bodily autonomy is best equipped to articulate. Every other Vault experiment violated the autonomy of its subjects by determining what conditions they would experience during their conscious existence. The cryogenic vaults violated the autonomy of their subjects at a more fundamental level. They determined whether their subjects would be conscious at all, and when, and under what circumstances the consciousness that constituted the subject's existence would be permitted to resume its operation. This is not simply a more severe form of the same violation that the other vaults committed. It is a different category of violation, organized around the institution's claim to authority over the most basic fact of another person's existence, the fact of whether that existence is currently occurring. The survivors of the cryogenic vaults carried into the wasteland a relationship with time and with the world that no other vault experience quite produced. A relationship organized around the specific knowledge of having been a person who was not present for the world's transformation from what it had been to what it had become. They had memories of a world that no longer existed, detailed and vivid and organized into the complete experiential narrative of a life that had been lived in circumstances utterly unlike those in which they now found themselves. They had the skills and the knowledge and the social frameworks of a civilization that had been destroyed in its entirety during the period of their suspension. They had the psychological architecture of people who had been shaped by a world that no longer existed to encounter a world that had been shaped by its destruction, carrying the pre-war human into the post-war wasteland in a form that was more complete and more uncompromising than any other survivor's version of the same transition. Because they had experienced that transition not as a gradual accommodation to changing circumstances, but as an instantaneous displacement from one world to another, with no intermediate experience to cushion the gap. What the wasteland did with these displaced people was what the wasteland did with everything it inherited from the world that had preceded it. It used what it could use and discarded what it could not, integrating the specific knowledge and the specific capabilities that the cryogenic survivors brought with them from the pre-war world into the post-war social landscape in the specific ways that the wasteland's communities found useful and disregarding the rest. The cryogenic survivors' relationship with their own displacement, the specific psychological work of integrating a pre-war identity with a post-war reality, of finding in the gap between the world they had expected to return to and the world they had returned to a continuity of self, that the gap itself threatened to dissolve, was not a concern that the wasteland's institutional infrastructure was particularly designed to address, and the survivors addressed it, or failed to address it, in the specific ways that their individual psychological resources permitted and the specific conditions of their particular post-revival situations allowed. The vault door that opened on a world transformed by 2 centuries of post-nuclear change was the Vault program's final and most honest communication with the people it had sealed inside honest, because it was not a communication at all, not a statement or an explanation or an acknowledgement of what the institution had done. and what it had intended, but simply the opening of a door that had been sealed for reasons the opening did not reveal, and into a world that the institution had not preserved in any of the ways its promotional materials had promised. The institution was gone. The research program was gone. The corporate structure that had organized the collection of data from the suspended and the studied and the deprived and the manipulated had been destroyed by the same catastrophe that the vault had been designed to shelter its residents from. What remained was the people, emerging from their various forms of institutional confinement into a world that their confinement had been part of producing, carrying the specific marks of the specific experiments that had organized their sealed existence, beginning the process of becoming the communities and the cultures and the factions and the wasteland itself that the world outside the vault now required them to build. There is a difference between not knowing and choosing not to know, between the ignorance of people who lacked access to relevant information and the ignorance of people who had access to relevant information and organized their institutional culture around the production and maintenance of conditions in which that information was never formally acknowledged or acted upon. The distinction matters enormously for the question of moral responsibility, because the ignorance of the first kind exculpates, while the ignorance of the second kind indicts not simply the individuals who chose not to know, but the institutional structures they built and maintained specifically to ensure that knowing would never be required of anyone whose knowing might have produced accountability. Vault-Tec did not lack access to information about what was happening inside its vaults. It had designed the information collection systems. It had specified the monitoring protocols. It had built into each vault's operational infrastructure the mechanisms through which data was recorded and, in the facilities whose external communication was maintained, transmitted to the corporate headquarters, whose research programs the data was being collected to serve. The corporation knew. The question is not whether it knew, but what knowing meant to an institution whose relationship with the welfare of the people it was studying was the relationship of a researcher to a research subject, rather than of a protector to the people it had promised to protect. The monitoring infrastructure that Vault-Tec maintained for receiving information from its experimental facilities was an infrastructure of extraordinary sophistication relative to what the Vault program's public presentation would have suggested was necessary for the management of what the public presentation described as civilian survival shelters. Survival shelters required administrative oversight, certainly required the transmission of operational data about life support, functionality, and supply consumption and population health metrics that any reasonable facilities management program would track and review. What they did not require, and what the monitoring infrastructure that Vault-Tec had actually built included as a standard feature of the program's data collection architecture, was the specific behavioral and social and psychological observation capability that each Vault's internal surveillance systems provided and whose output was recorded, transmitted where transmission was possible, and archived where transmission was not, according to protocols that reflected the research interests of the program rather than the operational requirements of the shelter management. That was the shelter program's public justification. The communications infrastructure between individual vaults and the corporate headquarters was not uniform across the Vault program's portfolio, reflecting the specific operational requirements of individual experimental designs rather than any consistent standard for the kind of external contact that sealed populations were permitted to maintain. Some vaults had regular communication channels with Vault-Tec personnel, channels through which the overseer reported on experimental progress and received guidance on the management of experimental conditions. Other vaults were designed for complete communication, isolation from the beginning of their operation. The experimental design requiring the kind of undisturbed observation that external contact would have complicated. The distinction between these two categories was not a distinction between vaults that were monitored and vaults that were not. All vaults were monitored through the internal surveillance systems whose data was stored locally even when it could not be transmitted externally. It was a distinction between vaults whose monitoring produced real-time data available to the corporation and vaults whose monitoring produced archived data that would be accessible when the vault was eventually entered by the corporate researchers or the enclave personnel who were the program's ultimate institutional beneficiaries. The specific knowledge that Vault-Tec's corporate leadership possessed about the outcomes of individual vault experiments was therefore a function of both the monitoring infrastructure and the communication architecture of each specific facility, and the record of what the corporation knew and when is accordingly uneven in ways that reflect the Vault program's organizational complexity, rather than any consistent pattern of corporate engagement with or avoidance of the leader information its experimental program was generating. Some outcomes were known in real time and were documented in corporate records that reflect institutional awareness of what specific experimental conditions were producing in specific populations. Other outcomes were not known to the corporate level until facility access permitted post-operational review of archived surveillance data and internal records. What was consistent across both categories was the institutional response to the knowledge of the response of an organization whose framework for processing information about its experimental programs was a research framework rather than an ethical one, organized around the question of what the data indicated about the experimental hypotheses, rather than around the question of what the data indicated about the welfare of the people who had generated it. The Vault-Tec board of directors, whose composition and deliberations the available pre-war documentation partially reconstructs, was a board organized around the specific institutional interests that had motivated the Vault program from its inception, the interests of an organization whose relationship with the federal government gave it resources and authority and protection from oversight that conventional corporations did not possess, and whose relationship with the enclave gave its experimental program a strategic purpose that extended beyond the commercial interests that motivated conventional defense contractors. The board members, who are most extensively documented in the available records, are documented as people who understood the Vault program's full dimensions, who knew it was an experimental program rather than a shelter program, who understood what the specific experimental designs they had approved were intended to produce, and who received and reviewed the data that the monitoring infrastructure generated with the engagement of people who were tracking the progress of research they had invested in, rather than the alarm of people who had discovered that the invested in institution they led was causing harm to the people in its care. Hugo Stoltz's personal vault, Vault 63, was the board members' prerogative, expressed in its most direct form, the use of the institutional infrastructure that Vault-Tec had built for nominally public purposes to serve the specific private research interests of an bodder individual who had the institutional authority to direct that infrastructure toward those interests without any meaningful check on the direction he chose. Stoltz was not the only board member who designed a vault according to their personal research interests rather than the program's formal experimental agenda, and the vaults that board members designed for personal purposes were, in some respects, the most honest expression of what the Vault program was, in institutional terms, a framework within which individuals with access to the program's resources could implement experimental designs of their own choosing against populations of people who had no knowledge of and no recourse against the experimental parameters being applied to them. The board's authority over the Vault program was the authority of researchers over a research infrastructure, and the board members exercised that authority with the specific freedom that researchers exercise when the ethical constraints that normally govern research involving human subjects have been systematically eliminated from the fees, institutional framework in which the research is conducted. The relationship between Vault-Tec and the Nuka-Cola Corporation as documented in the available pre-war records, was a relationship whose implications for the Vault program's experimental design extended beyond the simple commercial partnership that the two corporations' public relationship implied. The specific ways in which Nuka-Cola's products and experimental beverage formulations appeared in Vault experimental designs reflected an arrangement in which Vault-Tec's sealed experimental populations were available as test subjects for the corporate interests of a partner organization, as well as for the research program's own experimental agenda. Vault-34's armory and the specific configuration of its weapons inventory reflected Nuka-Cola's interest in the behavioral effects of specific environmental conditions on confined populations in ways that the Vault's official experimental rationale did not fully articulate. The corporate partnership, having created a framework in which the Vault program's experimental infrastructure was available for uses that the program's formal research agenda did not encompass, but that the program's organizational culture did not identify as requiring additional authorization. The Enclave's relationship with the Vault program was the relationship that made the full scope of the program's institutional project comprehensible. The political and military context within which the corporation's experimental ambitions made sense as something other than the expression of unconstrained institutional pathology. The Enclave had always understood the Vaults as something other than what the public presentation described them as, had participated in the program's design from a position of institutional knowledge about its actual purposes, that the public relationship between the government and the defense contractor did not reflect, had invested in the program's success as an organization whose post-war institutional plans depended on the program generating the specific kinds of data and the specific kinds of human material that the Enclave's vision of post-war America required. The super mutants that Vault-87's FEV deployment produced were not, from the Enclave's perspective, an experimental failure. They were a demonstration of capability whose implications for the Enclave's biological research programs were as significant as the implications of any other Vault experiment's outcomes. And the Enclave's engagement with the Vault program's biological legacy in the post-war period reflected the organization's understanding of itself as the legitimate heir to the program's research outputs, regardless of the circumstances that had made the program's subjects unavailable for further study. The specific question of accountability, of whether anyone within Vault-Tec's corporate structure ever faced any consequence for the program's atrocities, or whether any mechanism for such accountability existed or was ever seriously contemplated, is a question that the historical record answers with a clarity that requires no interpretive effort. The Great War destroyed the institutional infrastructure through which accountability would have been pursued, the regulatory agencies, the legal systems, the political processes, the public pressure mechanisms that a functioning society uses to impose consequences on institutional actors for institutional crimes with the same comprehensive efficiency that it destroyed everything else the pre-war world had built. The people who held the most significant institutional responsibility for the Vault program's design and operation were precisely the people who had been most effectively insulated from the catastrophe by the same institutional arrangements that had enabled the program's atrocities. The Enclave personnel, in their protected facilities, the highest-ranking Vault-Tec executives, whose Vault placements were not subject to the lottery systems that organized general public access, the members of the board whose personal vaults had been designed to the specifications that best served their individual survival rather than the experimental purposes that the program's formal justification required. The people who had designed Vault 11's annual sacrifice requirement were not among the people who experienced the consequences of living inside Vault 11. The people who had introduced FEV into Vault 87's ventilation system were not among the people who breathed that ventilation system's output. The people who had designed Vault 75's child acquisition pipeline were not among the parents whose children entered the school above the vault and did not return in the form that their parents had expected. The institutional arrangement that concentrated the power to design the Vault program's experimental parameters in the same people who were most effectively protected from the program's experimental outcomes was not an incidental feature of the Vault program's organizational structure. It was the feature that made the program possible in the specific form it took, the feature that removed from the people designing the experiments any personal stake in the experiences of the people living inside them, any mechanism by which the designer's own welfare was connected to the welfare of the designed, any consequence that would have provided an incentive to align the experimental parameters with the humanitarian purposes that the program's public justification claimed. The wasteland that the Vault's populations eventually emerged into was a wasteland that Vault-Tec had contributed to creating in ways that went beyond the corporation's obvious role as one of the pre-war world's most significant defense contractors. The specific character of the post-war human landscape, the specific distribution of communities and factions and biological entities and social formations that the wasteland contained 2 centuries after the bombs, reflected the Vault program's experimental outputs in ways that would be difficult to fully map, but that a sufficiently comprehensive historical analysis would find in almost every significant feature of the wasteland's social and political and biological character. The raider cultures that descended from Vault 15's designed incompatibilities, the super mutant populations that descended from Vault 87's FEV deployment, the specific ideological formations of communities that had organized themselves around the worldviews that Zax had manufactured in Vault 29's children, the specific moral frameworks of communities that had inherited the social formations produced by annual sacrifice in Vault 11 and deprivation in Vault 42 and gambling-based governance in Vault 21. All of it was Vault-Tec's legacy, as real and as permanent as the nuclear exchange itself, as formative of the wasteland's character as the bombs that the corporation had claimed to be protecting people from. The terminal entries and the holotapes and the administrative records and the Pip-Boy journals that the wasteland's explorers have recovered from vault after vault over the 2 centuries of the post-war period constitute, in their aggregate, the most comprehensive indictment of institutional betrayal that any human documentary record has ever assembled. They are the testimony of the people who were inside the experiments, preserved in the specific form of people writing about their experience from within it, rather than looking back at it from the outside, writing with the specific quality of people who do not know they are writing testimony, who do not know that what they are recording is evidence of anything other than the ordinary texture of the lives they are living. They are the record of institutional atrocity from the inside of the atrocity, the specific perspective that institutional documentation is designed to exclude, and that the Pip-Boy's personal record-keeping and the terminal's accessible journal function and the holotape's capacity to preserve, voice preserved in the specific way of technologies that were not designed to document crimes, but that documented them anyway, in the ordinary course of doing what they were designed to do. What those records, taken together, demand of anyone who reads them seriously is not simply moral condemnation of the institution that produced the conditions they document, though moral condemnation is appropriate and the available evidence supports it comprehensively. They demand the more difficult thing, the specific acknowledgement that the atrocities they document were not the products of exceptional evil or exceptional indifference or exceptional institutional dysfunction, but of entirely ordinary institutional processes operating without the ethical constraints that prevent ordinary institutional processes from producing atrocities. The people who designed the Vault experiments were not monsters in the sense of being categorically different from the people who were harmed by those designs. They were people who had been given extraordinary power over other people's lives by an institution that had decided the people in its power were research subjects rather than the people the institution was supposed to serve, and who had exercised that power in the specific ways that the institution's organizational culture permitted and encouraged and rewarded, without any of the countervailing pressures that accountability to the welfare of those in their power would have produced. This is the Vault program's most important lesson, and it is a lesson that the wasteland has not yet finished learning. Because the institutional dynamics that produce the program, the concentration of authority over vulnerable populations in the hands of people whose interests are not aligned with the welfare of those populations, the elimination of the oversight mechanisms that would otherwise impose accountability for the exercise of that authority, the development of an institutional culture in which the harm caused to vulnerable people by the institution's activities is processed as data rather than as the violation of a responsibility, are not dynamics that were unique to the pre-war world or to the specific institutional arrangements of Vault-Tec and the Enclave. They are dynamics that any institution can develop when the conditions that prevent their development are absent, and the wasteland contains institutions in various stages of developing them. Institutions whose relationship with the people in their power is organized around the institution's interests rather than around the welfare of those people, whose documentary culture produces the same quality of bureaucratic normality applied to human harm that the Vault-Tec records display with such disturbing comprehensiveness. The vault door is behind us now. The elevator rises. The irradiated air of the wasteland waits above, which is to say, the air of the world that Vault-Tec built from the raw material of the people it sealed inside its facilities and studied until the studying was done or the institution was destroyed, whichever came first. The world is not the world that the Vault program's designers had intended to produce with their research, but it is a world that their research helped to shape, and the people living in it are living with consequences of decisions that were made about them before they were born, in sealed rooms by people who understood those decisions as scientific rather than as moral, and who were never required by any surviving institutional authority to reconsider that understanding. The people came up out of the vaults anyway. That is the detail that the long accounting of the Vault program's crimes tends to obscure, and that the accounting requires restoring to visibility before it can be considered complete. The people who had been deprived of light built new settlements in the open air. The people whose communities had been fractured by designed incompatibility built new communities across the fractured lines. The people who had been subjected to FEV survived, and the people who had lived alongside them in the world the FEV produced learned to navigate that world with the specific adaptation that the wasteland survivors applied to everything it gave them. The children of Vault 75 who entered the wasteland, carrying the specific wounds of an institution that had valued their capabilities over their personhood, built lives in which their capabilities served purposes that the Fawn institution had not determined for them, in which the remarkable things they could do were, at least sometimes, things they had chosen to do, rather than things the experimental design had trained them to perform. None of this resolves the Vault program's crimes. None of it restores what the program took from the people it used. None of it constitutes the accountability that the institutional framework of the pre-war world would have imposed if that framework had survived to impose it, or that the wasteland's emerging institutions have not yet developed the stability and the moral vocabulary to impose in its absence. The crimes remain crimes regardless of what the people they were committed against subsequently built from the ruins of what was done to them. The resilience of the Vault program's survivors does not retroactively justify the conditions that required their resilience. It simply demonstrates what was already evident from the documentary record of the vaults themselves, that human beings subjected to institutional violence of extraordinary scope and duration retain the capacity, in the specific and irreducible way of things that cannot be entirely eliminated by whatever is brought against them, to continue being human, to write in their journals, to name their puppets, to remember what they loved and to mourn what they lost, and to refuse, even in the most comprehensive conditions of manufactured despair, to stop being the people that the institution had decided they were available for use as. That refusal is what the Pip-Boy records preserve most completely and most honestly, more completely and more honestly than any of the data that the Vault program's monitoring infrastructure collected and archived and transmitted for the use of the research program that had designed the conditions, the records, documented. The monitoring infrastructure recorded behavior. The Pip-Boy records recorded people, the specific, irreducible, unmanageable excess of human consciousness over the categories that institutional frameworks use to process it. The part of each vault resident's experience that exceeded what the experimental design had accounted for, and that the monitoring systems had recorded without knowing what they were recording. It is the most valuable thing the Vault program left behind, and it is the thing that the program had never intended to leave. The records are still there. In the vaults that remain sealed, the terminals still hold the journal entries of people who lived and worked and loved and despaired inside the experimental parameters, and did not know they were parameters. In the vaults that have been opened, the holotapes still carry the voices of people who are now 2 centuries gone, speaking into recording devices they carried on their wrists as they moved through the corridors of facilities that had been built to study them, leaving behind the testimony that was never intended as testimony in the specific form of people, simply describing what it was to be alive in the place they had been given to live. The vault door is open now. The light is waiting above. Let it carry you up and out and into the peaceable darkness of genuine rest, the rest that no experimental parameter determines and no institutional authority controls, the sleep that belongs to you alone in the specific and unviolable way that the Vault program could never quite reach, no matter how completely it controlled everything else. Rest now, wanderer. The accounting is done. The vaults are behind us. The world above, imperfect and irradiated and stubbornly, defiantly inhabited, is where we return. Sleep well in the knowledge that you came back up,